If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Gabriel Winters, but most people just call me Gabe. I've been the chief park ranger at Raven Rock State Forest for almost a decade now. It's a quiet place, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees, winding trails, and endless wildlife. Most days are uneventful, just me, my dog Scout, and the occasional hiker needing directions. But lately, things have been different. It started small. A few weeks ago, I noticed something strange: animals leaving the forest, deer, foxes, even birds. They were all heading out of Raven Rock like they knew something I didn't. At first I thought it was just a seasonal migration or maybe some kind of environmental shift. But then came the fog. This wasn't your normal morning mist. It was thick and heavy, rolling in during the middle of the day and clinging to everything like a wet blanket. It made the forest feel wrong, like it wasn't just empty but watching. And then there were the hikers. People started going missing. First one couple who'd been camping near Black Hollow Trail, then another solo hiker who'd been out birdwatching. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading anywhere, just gone. The sheriff, Old Man Hammond, came by my cabin last week to talk about it. He's a gruff guy with a permanent scowl etched on his face, but even he seemed rattled. "Gabe," he said, leaning against his patrol car as Scout sniffed at his boots, "I know you've seen some weird stuff out here over the years, but this is different." I nodded, crossing my arms as I leaned against the cabin door frame. "You think it sets an animal? Maybe a bear?" Hammond shook his head and lit a cigarette. "No tracks, no blood, nothing to suggest an attack." He took a long drag before exhaling slowly. "It seems like they just walked into thin air." I didn't say anything because I didn't have an answer either. But deep down I felt it too. Something was wrong with Raven Rock. A few days later, I decided to check out Black Hollow Trail myself, the last place that couple was seen before they disappeared. Scout trotted ahead of me as we made our way through the dense woods, his ears perked up and tail wagging like it was just another day in the park. But as we got closer to the campsite, I felt it again, that wrongness. The air was colder here, heavy with moisture from the fog that had rolled in overnight. And then I saw them strange little totems made of animal bones hanging from tree branches around the site. I crouched down to get a closer look at one of them, a small bundle of bones tied together with what looked like dried vines or sinew, and felt a chill run down my spine. "What is this?" I muttered under my breath. Scout let out a low growl behind me, his hackles raised as he stared into the trees ahead of us. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm as I stood up and scanned the area. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the silent woods. Nothing. Just the sound of Scout's growling and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. We stayed there for another minute or two before I decided we'd seen enough and headed back to the cabin. But even as we walked away from Black Hollow Trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. That night, I sat at my desk going through old park records while Scout snoozed on his bed by the fireplace. I wanted to see if there had been any other disappearances like this in Raven Rock's history, anything that might explain what was going on. And that's when I found it. An old report from 50 years ago about 3 hikers who vanished under similar circumstances near Black Hollow Trail during a particularly foggy autumn season. The ranger at the time had written about strange bone totems found near their campsite and described hearing whispers in the woods at night. My heart raced as I read through his account. It sounded almost identical to what was happening now. But what really got me was his final entry. "They are not animals. They are not human either." I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of it all. Was this some kind of local legend, a prank, or something else entirely? Before I could dive any deeper into my research, there was a knock at my door. The knock startled me. It was late, too late for visitors. Scout immediately perked up, his ears twitching as he let out a low growl. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door cautiously. Standing there was a woman in her mid-30s, bundled up in a thick jacket and scarf. She looked like she'd been traveling for hours. Her hair was messy, and her glasses were fogged up from the cold night air. "Sorry to bother you so late," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've assumed Dr. Abigail Foster. Are you Ranger Winters?" I nodded, still holding the door half closed. "That sips me. What can I do for you?" She gave me a polite smile and held up a leather-bound notebook. I'm an anthropologist. I've been researching Algonquin legends tied to this area, and I think they might be connected to the disappearances you've been having." I stared at her for a moment, unsure of what to say. It wasn't every day someone showed up at my cabin talking about legends and missing people. "Come inside," I said finally, stepping aside to let her in. Abigail sat at my kitchen table while I poured us both some coffee. Scout stayed close to my side, his eyes never leaving her, as if he didn't quite trust her yet. "So," I said, sitting across from her, "what's this about legends?" She opened the notebook and flipped through its pages until she found what she was looking for, a hand-drawn map of Raven Rock Forest with markings all over it. The Algonquin people believed this forest was home to something they called the Theta Hollow-Ones, she explained, pointing to one of the markings on the map. They described them as shadowy figures that could mimic voices and lure people into the woods. I raised an eyebrow. "Shadowy figures? Like ghosts?" "Not exactly," she said, shaking her head. "The stories say they set more like parasites. They take over people's bodies and use them to spread their influence." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded crazy, but then again so did bone totems and hikers vanishing without a trace. "And you think these hollow ones are real?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "But there's a pattern here." She pulled out another piece of paper, a timeline of disappearances dating back over a century. Every 50 years people go missing in this forest under similar circumstances. Always during the fall, always near Black Hollow Trail. I stared at the timeline, my stomach sinking as I realized she was right. The last major incident had been 50 years ago, the same one I'd read about in the old ranger's report. "What do you think they want?" I asked quietly. Abigail hesitated before answering. "The legends say they feed on fear and on life itself." The next morning, Abigail and I decided to check out Black Hollow Trail together. She wanted to see the bone totems for herself and gather any evidence that might support her theory. The fog was thicker than ever as we made our way through the woods, clinging to our clothes and muffling every sound except for the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. When we reached the campsite, Abigail immediately started taking photos of the totems while I kept watch with Scout by my side. "These are incredible," she said, examining one of them closely. "The craftsmanship is unsettlingly precise." "Yeah," I muttered, scanning the trees around us for any signs of movement. Unsettling is one way to put it. As she worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest felt too quiet, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence. "Do you hear that?" I asked suddenly. Abigail looked up from her camera, frowning. "Hear what?" "Exactly," I said. "It sits too quiet." She opened her mouth to respond, but froze when we both heard it. A faint whisper coming from deeper in the woods. It sounded like someone calling out for help, but their voice was distorted, like it was being played through an old radio. "Hello?" I called out instinctively, gripping my flashlight tighter. The whisper stopped abruptly. Abigail looked at me, her face pale. "We should go." I didn't argue. Back at the cabin, Abigail reviewed the photos she'd taken while I tried to make sense of what had just happened. "There's something else you should see," she said after a while, pulling out an old journal from her bag. "What's that?" I asked. "It belonged to one of the hikers who disappeared 50 years ago," she explained. "I found it in an archive while researching this area." She handed me the journal, and I flipped through its yellowed pages until something caught my eye, a sketch of a bone totem almost identical to the ones we'd seen today. Beneath it were 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They are here." That night, as Abigail slept on my couch and Scout curled up at my feet, I stayed up reading through more of the journal entries from 50 years ago. The hiker had written about hearing whispers in the woods at night, voices that sounded like his friends but weren't quite right. He described seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread every time he went near Black Hollow Trail. His final entry sent chills down my spine. If you're reading this, don't trust them. I closed the journal and set it down on the table, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. What were we dealing with? And how were we supposed to stop it? The next day, Abigail and I decided to stay out later than usual. We wanted to see if anything strange would happen after dark. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Being in the woods at night when people were disappearing felt like asking for trouble. But Abigail was determined, and deep down I knew we needed answers. We packed some supplies, flashlights, a first aid kit, and my radio, and headed back to Black Hollow Trail just before sunset. Scout came with us, his tail wagging like it was just another adventure. But I could tell he was on edge too. His ears kept twitching, and every now and then, he'd stop and sniff the air like he was picking up on something I couldn't see. By the time we reached the trail, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in shadows. The fog rolled in again, thicker than ever, swirling around our feet like it had a mind of its own. "This is unsettling," Abigail said quietly, adjusting her scarf as she scanned the area with her flashlight. "Yeah," I muttered, keeping my hand close to my sidearm. "Stay close." We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from our footsteps crunching on the leaves and Scout's occasional sniffs. But as we got deeper into the woods, that silence started to change. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it was wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then we heard it. A voice? "Help someone, please." It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. But as we stopped to listen, it grew louder and closer. "Did you hear that?" Abigail whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, gripping my flashlight tighter. "Stay behind me." The voice sounded human, desperate, even, but there was something off about it. The way it echoed through the trees didn't feel natural. It felt hollow. "Hello?" I called out cautiously, "Is someone there?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it repeated itself. "Help, please." Scout let out a low growl, his hackles raised as he stared into the darkness ahead of us. My stomach churned as I shone my flashlight in the direction of the voice, but there was nothing there, just trees and fog. "Maybe it sets an echo," Abigail suggested nervously, "or someone lost." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. We kept moving forward slowly, following the sound of the voice, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn back. And then we saw them. The bone totems, dozens of them this time, hanging from branches all around us, like some kind of twisted decoration. They swayed gently in the breeze, clinking together softly like wind chimes made of nightmares. "This is not normal," Abigail muttered under her breath as she snapped a photo with her camera. "No kidding," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. And then everything went silent again. For a moment, none of us moved. Even Scout stood frozen in place, his ears pinned back as he stared into the fog ahead of us. And then we saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, so quick that I almost thought I'd imagined it, but when I turned to look at Abigail, her face told me she'd seen it too. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said quietly, but we saw her leaving. We turned to head back toward the trailhead, but before we could take more than a few steps, something else happened, something that made my blood run cold. The voice came back, but this time it wasn't distant or faint. It was right behind us. "Help me." I spun around with my flashlight, but there was no one there, just more fog and shadows. Scout barked sharply, his growl turning into a frantic whine as he backed up against my legs. "Gabe." Abigail's voice trembled as she pointed ahead of us. I followed her gaze, and that steps when I saw them. Figures, tall and thin, with long limbs and faces that didn't look quite human, standing just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness like embers from a dying fire. They didn't move at first. They just stood there watching us with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. But then one of them tilted its head slightly to the side and mimicked my voice perfectly. "Stay close." I don't remember much after that moment, just pure panic taking over as I grabbed Abigail's arm and yelled for her to run. Scout bolted ahead of us as we sprinted back toward the trailhead, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. The whispers followed us, dozens of voices overlapping each other like a broken record playing on repeat. "Help me. Stay close." Dawn set to leave. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't, but I could hear them behind us. Their footsteps crunching on leaves and their distorted voices growing louder with every passing second. By some miracle, or maybe pure adrenaline, we made it back to my truck without tripping or getting lost in the fog. I threw open the door and shoved Abigail inside before climbing in myself and slamming it shut behind me. Scout jumped into the back seat just as one of those figures emerged from the tree line, a tall, shadowy shape with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I started the engine and floored it down the dirt road leading out of Raven Rock Forest. We didn't speak until we were miles away from Black Hollow Trail and safely back at my cabin. Even then, neither of us knew what to say. We were both too shaken by what we'd just experienced. Finally, Abigail broke the silence. "Those were them, weren't they? The hollow ones." I nodded slowly, staring at my hands on the steering wheel as they trembled slightly. "What do they want?" she asked softly. "Mine don't, but whatever it is, it stabs not good." That night felt longer than any other night in my life. Every creak of wood or rustle outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive with hidden dangers waiting to strike again. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening in Raven Rock Forest wasn't just legend, it was real. And if we didn't figure out how to stop it soon, more people were going to disappear. After the encounter at Black Hollow Trail, Abigail and I knew we couldn't handle this alone. Whatever was lurking in Raven Rock Forest wasn't just dangerous, it was something beyond our understanding. We needed help. The next morning, I called Sheriff Hammond and told him everything. At first he sounded skeptical, but when I described the glowing-eyed figures and bone totems, his tone changed. "You're not the first person to see things like that," he said grimly. By late afternoon, a small group had gathered at the town hall. It wasn't a big crowd, just Hammond, Abigail, me, and a few locals who'd heard about the disappearances and wanted answers. Among them was Marcus Redfeather, an elder from the local Algonquin community. He'd lived in Raven Rock his whole life and knew more about its history than anyone else. Marcus stood up slowly, his weathered face serious as he addressed the room. "The Hollow Ones are not a myth," he said, his voice steady but somber. "They've been here for centuries, feeding on fear and life itself. My ancestors tried to stop them many times, but they always come back." Abigail leaned forward in her seat. "Why every 50 years? Marcus nodded. "It's sets tied to the stars. Their power grows strongest during certain celestial alignments. That sets when they hunt." The room fell silent as we all processed what he was saying. "So what do we do?" Hammond asked finally. "How do we stop them?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "There sits an old tribal site deep in the forest, a place where rituals were performed to seal them away. But it's dangerous to go there now. They will do everything they can to stop us." Despite the risks, we decided to form a search team to investigate the site and hopefully find a way to stop the Hollow Ones before more people disappeared. Hammond volunteered to lead the effort alongside me and Abigail. Marcus agreed to guide us through the forest since he knew its trails better than anyone. We also recruited 2 deputies, Patterson and Meredith, who were young but eager to help. They didn't fully believe in the supernatural side of things yet, but they trusted Hammond enough to follow his lead. As we prepared for the journey, Marcus pulled me aside. "Be careful," he said quietly. "The Hollow Ones are clever. They still try to turn us against each other." I nodded, my stomach tightening at his warning. "We still stick together." He gave me a hard look. "Make sure you do." We set out early the next morning, carrying supplies for what could be a long trek into the forest. The fog was already thick by the time we reached Black Hollow Trail, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Marcus led the way with Scout trotting close behind him. Abigail stayed near me, her camera slung over her shoulder as she scanned the area for anything unusual. The deeper we went into Raven Rock Forest, the stranger things became. Paths that should have been familiar twisted in ways that didn't make sense, leading us in circles or splitting off into directions that weren't on any map. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Patterson asked nervously as we stopped to check our bearings. Marcus frowned at his compass, which seemed to be spinning erratically. "It's Sepp's playing tricks on us." "What Sepp said?" Meredith asked skeptically. Marcus didn't said answer. He just kept walking. As we continued deeper into the woods, we started noticing signs of the hollow ones everywhere. More bone totems hanging from trees, strange claw marks on rocks, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At one point, Scout stopped dead in his tracks and let out a low growl, the same warning he'd given me before our first encounter with them. "What is it?" I asked him quietly. He didn't respond. He just stared into the fog ahead of us with his hackles raised. "I don't like this," Patterson muttered under his breath. "None of us do," Hammond said firmly. But we set not turning back. By midday, tensions were running high among the group. The oppressive atmosphere of the forest was starting to get to everyone, especially Patterson and Meredith, who seemed increasingly paranoid about every sound or shadow around us. "This is insane," Patterson said at one point, as we stopped for a break near a rocky outcrop. "They are not ghosts," Marcus said calmly as he unpacked some food from his bag. "And if you don't believe me now, you will soon." Patterson scoffed, but didn't argue further. As we ate lunch in uneasy silence, Abigail pulled out her notebook and started sketching one of the bone totems hanging nearby. "These markings," she said thoughtfully as she studied it closely, "they look like some kind of warning." "Warning about what?" Meredith asked nervously. Abigail hesitated before answering us. The group fell silent again as her words sank in. When we set out again after lunch, things took an even darker turn. The whispers grew louder and more frequent, sometimes sounding like people we knew calling out for help or shouting warnings from somewhere deep in the fog. At one point, Patterson swore he saw someone standing between two trees ahead of us, a figure that looked eerily like his younger brother who died years ago. "It's him," Patterson shouted as he broke away from the group and ran toward it despite our protests. "Stop," Hammond yelled after him, but it was too late. The figure disappeared into the fog just as Patterson reached it, and moments later so did Patterson himself. We spent hours searching for him, but found no trace, just more bone totems and claw marks leading deeper into the woods. Meredith was visibly shaken by what had happened, and honestly, so was I. "They're picking us off?" she said quietly as she clutched her flashlight tightly in both hands. "We won't let them," Hammond said firmly. But even he sounded uncertain now. By nightfall, we were all exhausted and terrified, but Marcus insisted we keep moving toward the tribal site before it was too late. "They're strongest at night," he warned us, as we trudged through another twisted path that seemed designed to disorient us completely. "Great," Meredith muttered under her breath, but she kept walking anyway. As darkness fell over Raven Rock Forest completely, I couldn't shake one thought. Marcus had been right. The hollow ones were trying to turn us against each other, and so far they were succeeding. The forest at night was a different beast altogether. The fog seemed thicker now, swirling around us like it had a purpose. Every sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves felt amplified, like the forest itself was alive and breathing around us. The air was colder too, biting at my face and hands as we pressed forward. Marcus led the way with a lantern in hand, his face calm but focused. Abigail walked beside me, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Hammond stayed at the back of the group, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, while Meredith stuck close to him, her eyes darting nervously at every shadow. Scout stayed by my side, his ears pinned back and his tail low. He hadn't barked or growled since Patterson disappeared. Just stayed quiet and alert, like he knew we couldn't afford to draw attention to ourselves. "We stir close," Marcus said after what felt like hours of walking. "The site should be just ahead." "How can you tell?" Abigail asked quietly. Marcus tapped his temple. I can feel it. I didn't question him. At this point, I was willing to trust anything that might get us out of this nightmare alive. We came to a clearing where the trees thinned out, revealing a massive rock formation jutting up from the ground like a jagged tooth. It was covered in moss and strange carvings that looked ancient, symbols and patterns that didn't make any sense to me, but seemed to mean something to Marcus. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Abigail stepped closer to examine the carvings while Marcus knelt down and began unpacking something from his bag, what looked like small bundles of herbs tied together with string. "What are those for?" I asked him. "Protection," he said simply. "They won't stop the hollow ones completely, but they might slow them down." I nodded and took one of the bundles when he offered it to me. It smelled earthy and sharp, like sage mixed with something bitter. As we stood there trying to make sense of the carvings and Marcus's preparations, Scout suddenly let out a low growl, the first sound he'd made in hours. "What is it?" I asked him quietly, shining my flashlight in the direction he was staring. That's when I saw them, shadows moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. At first they were faint, barely visible against the foggy backdrop, but as they got closer their shapes became clearer, tall and thin with glowing eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. "They're here," Marcus said calmly as he stood up and lit one of the herb bundles with a match. The smoke curled up into the air around him, carrying that sharp, earthy smell with it. "What do we do?" Meredith asked, her voice shaking as she gripped her flashlight tightly. "Stay together," Hammond said firmly, as he raised his shotgun. "And don't listen to them." The hollow ones didn't charge at us or attack outright. They just stood there at first, watching us from the edge of the clearing like predators sizing up their prey. But then they started moving, slowly circling around us like wolves closing in on a herd. And then came the whispers. "Help me. Don't leave. It's safe here." The voices were distorted and wrong, like someone trying to imitate human speech but not quite getting it right. They echoed through the clearing, overlapping each other until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. "Donset, listen," Marcus shouted over the noise as he waved his smoking herb bundle toward one of the shadows. "They will try to confuse you," but it was easier said than done. The voices weren't just sounds, they were memories. I heard my mother's voice calling my name from somewhere deep in the fog even though she'd been dead for years. Abigail froze beside me as she stared into the darkness with wide eyes, her lips trembling as if she wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. "Abigail." I grabbed her arm and shook her gently until she snapped out of it. "Donset, listen. It's not real." She blinked at me like she was waking up from a dream before nodding quickly and gripping her flashlight tighter. The hollow ones grew bolder as we stood our ground. One of them stepped into the clearing completely, a tall figure with unnaturally long limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Hammond fired his shotgun at it without hesitation. The blast echoed through the clearing like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, the creature was still standing. It tilted its head slightly to one side as if curious before mimicking Hammond Sepp's voice perfectly. "Don't listen." Meredith screamed and stumbled backward into Abigail, who caught her just before she fell. "They're playing with us," Marcus said grimly, as he lit another herb bundle and tossed it toward one of the shadows. The smoke seemed to make them hesitate for a moment, before they started circling again. "We needed a plan, and fast." "Marcus," I said urgently as I kept my flashlight trained on one of the creatures, "what do we do? How do we stop them?" "There's an entrance," he said quickly, pointing toward one side of the rock formation, where an opening was barely visible through the fog. "A cave, it leads to an old ritual site." "And what happens there?" Hammond asked sharply as he reloaded his shotgun. "We seal them away," Marcus replied simply, but there was something in his tone that made my stomach churn. We didn't have time to argue or ask questions. The hollow ones were closing in fast now, their whispers growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. One by one, we made our way toward the cave entrance, while Marcus waved his smoking herb bundles to keep them at bay as best he could. Scout stayed close by my side, growling softly under his breath but not barking, like even he knew silence was our best defense right now. As we reached the entrance and stepped inside, I couldn't shake one thought. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The cave was cold and damp, with walls that seemed to close in around us the farther we went. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, their beams bouncing off jagged rocks and uneven ground. Every step echoed faintly, making it feel like we weren't alone, even though we were all crammed together in the narrow tunnel. Scout stayed close to me, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed cautiously. He wasn't growling anymore, but his body was tense, his ears twitching at every little sound. "Keep moving," Marcus said quietly from the front of the group. His voice was calm, but I could see the strain on his face as he led us deeper into the cave. We said are almost there. "Almost where?" Meredith asked nervously. She was clutching her flashlight so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "To the ritual site," Marcus replied without looking back. "It's steps where they were sealed before." Abigail glanced at me, her expression a mix of curiosity and fear. "What kind of ritual are we talking about?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, it sets our best shot." After what felt like an eternity of walking, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber. The ceiling was high enough that our flashlight beams couldn't reach it, and the walls were covered in carvings similar to the ones we'd seen on the rock formation outside, symbols and patterns that seemed ancient and otherworldly. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar surrounded by a circle of blackened rocks. The air felt heavier here, like we'd stepped into a place that didn't quite belong in our world. "This is it," Marcus said softly as he stepped into the circle and knelt by the altar. "What now?" Hammond asked, his shotgun still at the ready as he scanned the shadows around us. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out an old leather-bound journal, the same one Abigail had shown me back at my cabin. "This belonged to one of my ancestors," he explained as he flipped through its pages. "It describes how they sealed the Hollow Ones away last time." "And what does it say?" Abigail asked eagerly, stepping closer to get a better look. Marcus hesitated before answering. "It steps not just about sealing them away, it steps about keeping them from coming back." As Marcus read aloud from the journal, we learned more about the Hollow Ones than we ever wanted to know. They weren't just parasites, they were something far worse. They fed on fear and despair, using their victims' emotions to grow stronger and spread their influence. The ritual described in the journal involved using meteorite iron, metal that had fallen from the sky centuries ago, to create a barrier that would trap them in this world and prevent them from crossing over completely. But there was a catch. "The barrier requires a sacrifice," Marcus said grimly as he closed the journal and looked up at us. "A sacrifice?" Meredith repeated, her voice shaking. "What kind of sacrifice?" Marcus met her gaze evenly. "A life." The room fell silent as his words sank in. None of us wanted to believe it, but deep down, I think we all knew he was telling the truth. "There has to be another way," Abigail said finally, her voice trembling but determined. Before she could finish her sentence, Scout let out a sharp bark that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. We all turned toward him just in time to see one of the Hollow Ones emerging from the tunnel behind us. Its glowing eyes burned brighter than ever as it stepped into the light of our flashlights, its long limbs moving with an unnatural grace that made my skin crawl. "They set her here," Marcus said quietly as he stood up and lit another bundle of herbs. "We don't have much time." The Hollow One didn't attack right away, it just stood there watching us with those eerie glowing eyes. But then more of them appeared behind it, their shadows stretching across the walls like living nightmares. "We need to finish this," Hammond said firmly as he raised his shotgun and fired at the nearest creature. The blast echoed through the chamber, but just like before, it didn't seem to do any real damage. "They sipped trying to scare us," Marcus said over his shoulder as he began arranging items on the altar. More herbs, small stones carved with symbols, and what looked like pieces of meteorite iron wrapped in cloth. "Don't sift, let them." "That's easy for you to say." Meredith snapped as she backed away from one of the creatures that had gotten too close for comfort. Focus. Hammond barked at her before turning back to Marcus. What do you need us to do? Keep them back while I prepare. Marcus replied without looking up from his work. We formed a loose circle around Marcus and the altar, using whatever tools we had, flashlights, weapons, even scouts barking to keep the hollow ones at bay. But they weren't making it easy for us. Every time one of them got too close, it would mimic someone's voice, calling out for help or begging us to stop what we were doing. It was disorienting and terrifying all at once, and I could see how much it was affecting everyone else too. Meredith was shaking so badly that she dropped her flashlight at one point, and when she bent down to pick it up, one of the hollow ones lunged at her. I reacted without thinking, grabbing her arm and pulling her back just in time, but not before its long fingers brushed against her shoulder. She screamed as she stumbled backward into me, and when I looked down at her face, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Her eyes were starting to glow faintly in the darkness. They got her. Abigail shouted as she grabbed Meredith's other arm and tried to pull her away from me, but it was too late. Meredith let out a guttural scream that didn't sound human, and then she turned on us with an unnatural strength that sent both Abigail and me sprawling onto the ground. Hammond fired his shotgun again, but this time it wasn't aimed at one of the hollow ones, it was aimed at Meredith. No. Abigail screamed as she scrambled toward him, but Hammond held firm, even as tears streamed down his face. "She's gone," he said quietly before pulling the trigger again, and this time everything went silent except for Scout Sip's soft whine beside me. The silence in the chamber was suffocating. Meredith's body lay still on the cold stone floor, her glowing eyes dimming until they were nothing more than lifeless pools. Hammond stood over her, his shotgun hanging loosely at his side, his face pale and hollow. He didn't say a word. None of us did. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on all of us like a heavy blanket. Scout whimpered softly beside me, nudging my leg as if trying to comfort me. I reached down and scratched his head absent-mindedly, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. "She didn't deserve that," Abigail said finally, her voice trembling as she knelt beside Meredith's body. "She wasn't sit herself anymore," Marcus said quietly as he continued working at the altar. "The hollow ones had taken her." "That doesn't make it right," Abigail snapped, glaring at him through tear-filled eyes. Marcus didn't respond. He just kept arranging the meteorite iron and herbs with steady hands, his face grim and focused. Hammond finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "How much longer?" "Not long," Marcus replied without looking up. "But we need to be ready for what comes next." "What comes next?" I asked cautiously, already dreading the answer. Marcus looked up at me then, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place: fear, regret, determination, maybe all three. "The hollow ones once set, let us finish this ritual without a fight," he said simply. "They said they'll do everything they can to stop us." "And what happens if we don't finish it?" Abigail asked quietly. Marcus hesitated before answering. "Then they shall take us all, and this forest will never be safe again." The room fell silent again as his words sank in. None of us wanted to believe it, but deep down, I think we all knew he was telling the truth. As Marcus continued working at the altar, Abigail and I moved Meredith's body to the side of the chamber, covering her with one of our jackets out of respect. Hammond stayed near the entrance with Scout, keeping watch for any signs of movement from the hollow ones. It wasn't set long before they returned. The whispers started first, soft and distant at first, but growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. They echoed through the chamber like voices carried on the wind, overlapping each other until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. "Help me. Don't leave. It's safe here." I clenched my fists as I tried to block them out, focusing instead on Marcus's steady movements at the altar. But it wasn't easy. The voices weren't just sounds, they were memories. I heard my father's voice calling my name from somewhere deep in the darkness, even though he'd been gone for years. Abigail froze beside me as she stared into the shadows with wide eyes, her lips trembling as if she wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. "Abigail." I grabbed her arm and shook her gently until she snapped out of it. "Don't listen. It's not real." She blinked at me like she was waking up from a dream before nodding quickly and gripping her flashlight tighter. The hollow ones grew bolder as we stood our ground. One by one, they stepped into the chamber completely. Tall figures with unnaturally long limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets being controlled by invisible strings. Hammond fired his shotgun at one of them without hesitation. The blast echoed through the chamber like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, the creature was still standing. It tilted its head slightly to one side as if curious, before mimicking Hammond Sip's voice perfectly. "Don't listen." Scout barked sharply beside me as he lunged toward one of the creatures, but I grabbed him by the collar just in time to pull him back before it could reach him. "They're playing with us," Marcus said grimly as he lit another bundle of herbs and tossed it toward one of the shadows. The smoke seemed to make them hesitate for a moment before they started circling again. We needed a plan, and fast. "Marcus," I said urgently as I kept my flashlight trained on one of the creatures. "What do we do? How do we stop them?" "There's Sep's only one way," he replied without looking up from his work at the altar. "The ritual requires blood, a sacrifice." I felt my stomach drop as his words sank in. "A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" Marcus met my gaze evenly then, and I knew what he meant even before he said it. "A life." The room fell silent again as his words hung in the air like a heavy weight pressing down on all of us. "There has to be another way," Abigail said finally, her voice trembling but determined. Before she could finish her sentence, Scout let out a sharp bark that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, and we all turned toward him just in time to see one of the hollow ones lunging toward Hammond from behind. Hammond reacted instinctively, spinning around and firing his shotgun point blank at its glowing eyes. But this time, something changed. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech as it staggered backward into the shadows, and when it disappeared completely, Hammond collapsed onto his knees beside Scout. "Hammond!" Abigail shouted as she ran toward him, but when she reached him, she froze in place. His eyes were glowing faintly in the darkness, just like Meredith Sep's had before she turned on us completely. "Hammond!" Abigail's voice cracked as she knelt beside him. His head was bowed, his breathing shallow. When he finally looked up, the faint glow in his eyes sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't as strong as Meredith's had been, but it was there, like a flicker of something trying to take hold. "I'm fine," Hammond said gruffly, pushing Abigail's hand away as she tried to steady him. But his voice wasn't convincing. He sounded off, like he was forcing himself to stay in control. "You're not fine," I said, stepping closer with Scout at my side. "They're getting to you." Hammond shook his head stubbornly. "I can fight it." "No one can fight it," Marcus said from the altar, his tone grim. "Once they touched you, it's only a matter of time." Hammond glared at him, his jaw tightening. "Then we don't have time to waste." Marcus worked faster now, his hands moving with purpose as he arranged the meteorite, iron, and herbs in precise patterns on the altar. The carvings on the walls seemed to glow faintly in response, like they were coming to life. "We stir close," he said, without looking up. "But we need the final piece." "What final piece?" Abigail asked, her voice tense. Marcus hesitated before answering. "The blood sacrifice." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "No," Abigail said firmly, shaking her head. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Marcus replied quietly. "The ritual won't work without it." Before anyone could say anything else, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They echoed through the chamber, overlapping and distorting until they were almost deafening. "Help me. Stay with us. It's safe here." The hollow ones stepped closer, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like embers from a dying fire. There were more of them now, too many to count, and they were closing in fast. "We don't have time for this," Hammond shouted as he raised his shotgun again, his hands trembling slightly. "Just do what you need to do." "No," Abigail snapped, turning to Marcus with desperation in her eyes. "There has to be another way. We can it's him." Marcus interrupted. nodding toward Hammond. His voice was calm but firm, like he'd already made up his mind. "What?" I asked sharply, stepping between them instinctively. "He sep's already turning," Marcus explained. "If we don't stet act now, he sep become one of them, and we sep will lose our chance to stop this." Hammond let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he lowered his shotgun. "Well, that sip's convenient." "It's set's not about convenience," Marcus said evenly. "It's set's about survival." Hammond looked at me then, his expression hard but resigned. "Do it." "No," I said immediately, my chest tightening at the thought of what he was asking me to do. "Gabe," Hammond said firmly, stepping closer until he was standing right in front of me. "You know I step 'em right. If this is the only way to stop them, then you have to do it." "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers growing louder around us. "You can," Hammond insisted, gripping my shoulder tightly. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd known for years, the man who'd always done whatever it took to protect this town. "Please," he said quietly, "don't let this be for nothing." The hollow ones were almost upon us now, their long limbs reaching out toward us as their distorted voices filled the chamber with an unbearable cacophony. "Gabe," Marcus shouted from the altar. We stir out of time. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands as I raised my knife. "And sorry," I whispered. Hammond nodded once, his expression calm and resolute, as he stepped into the circle around the altar. And then it was over. The moment Hammond's blood touched the meteorite iron on the altar, everything changed. The carvings on the walls flared brightly with an otherworldly light that filled the chamber completely, blinding and overwhelming but strangely warm at the same time. The hollow ones let out an ear-piercing screech as they recoiled from the light, writhing and twisting like shadows caught in a fire before disappearing into nothingness one by one. When the light finally faded, everything was silent again. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the lingering brightness as I looked around the chamber. Hammond was gone, his body reduced to ash that scattered across the altar like dust in the wind. Abigail was on her knees beside me, tears streaming down her face as she stared at what remained of him. Marcus stood silently by the altar, his expression unreadable as he placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head in respect. Scout nudged my leg gently with his nose, his way of reminding me that we were still here, that we'd survived. But at what cost? We made our way out of the cave in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because none of us knew how to say it. The forest was eerily quiet now, no whispers or shadows lurking in the fog, just an empty stillness that felt both comforting and unsettling at once. When we finally reached the trailhead where our journey had begun, Abigail turned to me with red-rimmed eyes and whispered two words. "It sep's over." I wanted to believe her. I really did, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. We thought it was over. As we stepped out of the cave and into the clearing, the forest felt different, quieter, calmer. The fog had lifted, revealing a pale moonlight that bathed everything in an eerie glow. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. Marcus was the first to speak. "It's not done," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence like a fragile thread snapping. "What do you mean it's not done?" Abigail asked, her voice sharp with exhaustion and anger. "Hammond, he gave his life for this. We saw them disappear." Marcus shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "We stopped them from crossing over completely, but we didn't destroy them. They still here, waiting." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as Marcus's words sank in. He was right. The hollow ones weren't gone. They were just hiding. "So what do we do now?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus turned to me, his dark eyes filled with a weary determination. "We finish what we started. We didn't have much time to prepare." Marcus explained that the ritual had weakened the hollow ones but hadn't sealed them away completely. To finish the job, we needed to return to the heart of the forest, the place where their power was strongest, and destroy whatever connection they had to this world. "It sets an anchor," Marcus said as we gathered our supplies and prepared to head back into the woods. "Something tying them here. A physical object or place that holds their essence." "How do we find it?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They set lead us to it," Marcus replied simply. "They one step let us destroy it without a fight." The journey back into the forest felt different this time. The air was heavier and every step seemed harder than the last, like the forest itself was trying to push us back. Scout stayed close to my side, his ears pinned back and his tail low as he sniffed cautiously at the ground. Abigail walked beside me, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she scanned the trees around us for any signs of movement. Marcus led the way with his lantern held high, his expression calm but focused. None of us spoke as we made our way deeper into Raven Rock Forest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. It wasn't set long before they returned. The whispers started softly at first, just faint murmurs on the edge of hearing, but they grew louder and more insistent with every step we took. "Help me. Don't sit, leave. It's safe here." I clenched my fists and tried to block them out, focusing instead on Scout's steady presence beside me, but it wasn't easy. The voices weren't just sounds, they were memories. I heard Hammond's voice calling out to me from somewhere deep in the fog, begging me to turn back. "Gabe." Abigail's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to reality. She was staring at something ahead of us with wide eyes, her flashlight trembling in her hand. I followed her gaze and froze. In front of us stood one of the hollow ones, but this time it wasn't just a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. It looked human. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes sunken and hollow, but there was no mistaking who it was supposed to be. "Hammond," Abigail whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. The creature tilted its head slightly to one side as if studying us before speaking in Hammond-Sepp's voice. "Turn back." For a moment, none of us moved. None of us breathed. The creature's glowing eyes seemed to pierce right through me as it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "Turn back," it repeated, its voice distorted and wrong, like a recording played at half speed. "We can sit," Marcus said firmly, stepping forward with his lantern held high. "We know what you are, and we are not afraid of you." The creature let out a low growl that sent chills down my spine before lunging toward him. But Marcus didn't flinch. He held up one of his herb bundles and lit it with a match, sending a plume of smoke into the air around him. The creature recoiled from the smoke with an ear-piercing screech before disappearing into the shadows, but I knew it wasn't gone for good. "They were trying to scare us," Marcus said calmly as he turned back to face us. We pushed forward, despite the whispers and shadows closing in around us, despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back. The deeper we went into Raven Rock Forest, the more distorted everything became. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like claws toward us. The ground beneath our feet felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment. And then we found it. In a small clearing surrounded by gnarled trees stood an ancient stone monolith covered in carvings similar to those we'd seen in the cave. But these were darker somehow, more sinister. "This is it," Marcus said quietly as he stepped forward with his lantern raised high. "Their anchor." "What do we do?" Abigail asked nervously as she scanned the shadows around us for any signs of movement. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt beside the monolith and began unpacking his supplies. More meteorite iron, herbs tied together with string, and what looked like a small ceremonial dagger carved from bone. "We destroy it," he said finally, as he arranged everything carefully on the ground around him, but they one set let us do it easily. As if on cue, they appeared. Dozens of hollow ones emerged from the shadows around us, their glowing eyes burning brighter than ever as they closed in on our small circle of light. Abigail let out a sharp gasp beside me as she gripped her flashlight tightly, but I didn't have time to comfort her or reassure her that everything would be okay because I wasn't sure if it would be. All I knew was that we had come too far to fail now, and I wasn't going down without a fight. The hollow ones surrounded us, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like tiny fires. They didn't rush us all at once. They didn't need to. They moved slowly, deliberately, closing in as if they knew we had nowhere to run. Marcus worked quickly, arranging the meteorite iron and herbs around the monolith while muttering something under his breath. Words I didn't understand but could feel in the air around us. Abigail stood beside him, her flashlight trembling in her grip as she tried to keep the creatures at bay. I held Scout close, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. The creatures were everywhere now, circling us like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need more time," Marcus shouted over his shoulder as he lit one of the herb bundles with a match. The smoke curled up into the air around him, creating a barrier that seemed to keep the hollow ones at bay for now. "How much time?" I yelled back, gripping my flashlight tightly. "Just a few more minutes," he replied, his voice strained but steady. The hollow ones didn't wait long before testing our defenses. One of them lunged toward Abigail, its long limbs reaching out for her with unnatural speed. She screamed and swung her flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the darkness like a knife, but it wasn't enough. I reacted without thinking, grabbing a burning herb bundle from Marcus's bag and throwing it toward the creature. The smoke hit it square in the chest, and it let out an ear-piercing screech before retreating into the shadows. "Stay close," I shouted to Abigail as she stumbled back toward me, her breathing ragged and panicked. "I'm trying," she gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus continued his work at the monolith, his hands moving with purpose as he carved symbols into its surface with the bone dagger. The carvings glowed faintly in the dim light of his lantern, pulsing with an energy that made my skin crawl. "They said her tied to this place," he said, as he worked. "If we destroy their anchor, they said her have no way to stay here." "And how do we destroy it?" Abigail asked desperately. Marcus hesitated for just a moment before answering. "With fire." As if on cue, one of the hollow ones broke through our defenses and lunged toward Marcus. This one was faster than the others, its movements jerky and unnatural but terrifyingly effective. I didn't have time to think, I just acted. I grabbed Marcus by the back of his jacket and yanked him out of the way just as the creature's long fingers scraped across the surface of the monolith. The creature let out another screech and turned its glowing eyes on me, but before it could attack again, Scout lunged at it with a ferocity I'd never seen before. His sharp teeth sank into its shadowy form, and for a moment, it seemed to falter. "Scout? No." I shouted, but it was too late. The creature twisted violently, throwing him off before disappearing into the darkness once more. Scout landed hard on the ground beside me, letting out a low whine as he struggled to get back on his feet. My heart clenched painfully in my chest as I knelt beside him, running my hands over his fur to check for injuries. "You said you're okay," I whispered shakily. "You said you're okay." "We're still running out of time," Marcus shouted as he finished carving the last symbol into the monolith. "We need to light it now." Abigail fumbled with her lighter, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold on to it. "I'll do it," I said quickly, grabbing the lighter from her and flicking it on. The small flame danced in my hand as I stepped forward toward the monolith. The hollow ones seemed to sense what we were about to do because they surged forward all at once, dozens of them emerging from the shadows with their glowing eyes fixed on us. "Hold them off," Marcus yelled as he grabbed another burning herb bundle and waved it toward the advancing creatures. Abigail and I stood shoulder to shoulder with him, using everything we had, flashlights, burning herbs, even rocks to keep them at bay while I held on to that tiny flame like it was our last hope. Finally, we reached the monolith. I pressed the lighter against one of Marcus's herb bundles and watched as it caught fire instantly, the flames spreading quickly across the surface of the ancient stone like they were alive. The hollow ones let out a collective screech that shook me to my core as they recoiled from the burning monolith. But they didn't retreat completely. They circled us like vultures now, waiting for their chance to strike again. "It set's not enough," Marcus shouted over their cries, "We need more fire." Without thinking twice, I grabbed one of our lanterns from Marcus's bag and smashed it against the base of the monolith, the oil inside igniting instantly and sending flames roaring up its surface. The carvings glowed brighter than ever now, pulsing with an intense energy that made my head spin. But I didn't let go of Scout or Abigail Sip's hand until finally everything went still again. When I opened my eyes, we were alone in Raven Rock Forest once more. My name is Harold Nakamura, but most people just call me Hal. I've been a park ranger at Crater Lake National Park for over 25 years. It's my home, my sanctuary, and if I'm honest, the only thing keeping me going since my wife passed away 5 years ago. She loved this place as much as I do. I still wear my wedding ring. I guess it's my way of keeping her close. Crater Lake is breathtaking. The water is so blue it looks like it's been painted, and the towering cliffs make you feel like you're standing in another world. But beneath all that beauty, there's something else, something ancient and unsettling. The indigenous tribes have stories about the lake, warnings passed down through generations. Most people brush them off as myths, but I've spent enough time here to know there's truth in those old legends. It was a quiet morning, just after dawn. The lake was perfectly still, like glass. I was out on my routine boat patrol, checking the water temperature and making sure everything was normal. But that day, something wasn't right. The reading showed the water near Wizard Island was warmer than it should be. Much warmer. That's unusual for Crater Lake, where the water is always icy cold. As I steered closer to the island, I saw them, lights, faint, glowing lights moving beneath the surface of the water. At first, I thought it might be sunlight reflecting off the waves, but they were too bright and too steady for that. They seemed alive, almost like they were dancing. Later that morning, a local fisherman stopped by the ranger station looking shaken. He said he'd heard singing coming from the lake while he was fishing at night, soft and haunting, like voices calling to him. I didn't tell him about what I'd seen earlier. I didn't want to scare him more than he already was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was stirring in Crater Lake. The next morning, the park was buzzing with news. A honeymooning couple had gone missing overnight. Their campsite was near the edge of the lake, tucked away in one of the quieter spots. At first, we thought maybe they'd wandered off and gotten lost. It happens sometimes. People underestimate how easy it is to lose your bearings in the wilderness. But when we got to their site, it was clear something else had happened. Their tent was still there, perfectly intact. Their backpacks were still inside, along with their food and supplies. Nothing looked disturbed, except for the ground outside. 2 sets of footprints led straight from their tent to the water's edge, and then stopped. Just stopped. There were no signs of them turning back or walking anywhere else. It was like they'd stepped into the lake and vanished. I crouched down near the shoreline, scanning for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. A strange, slimy substance clinging to the rocks. It was clear and jelly-like, almost like something you'd find washed up on a beach, but thicker and stickier. I touched it with my glove, and it felt cold, colder than the water itself. The sight of those footprints haunted me all day. People don't just walk into a freezing lake in the middle of the night without a reason, and that jelly, I'd never seen anything like it before. Later that evening, as I sat in my office trying to piece things together, I remembered an old story Joseph Running Bear had told me years ago. He's a tribal elder who knows all the legends about Crater Lake. One of them talks about star jelly, a substance left behind by beings that come from the deep, a warning sign of something unnatural. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just a simple disappearance. Something was drawing people into the lake. After the couple's disappearance, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. Whatever was happening at Crater Lake wasn't normal, and it wasn't something I could explain away. I went to my supervisor, Karen, and told her everything. The footprints, the jelly, the lights I'd seen near Wizard Island. She looked skeptical, but she agreed to let me form a team to investigate. The first person I called was Dr. Patricia Werner, a limnologist who'd been studying Crater Lake's ecosystem for years. Patricia's one of the smartest people I know, and she doesn't scare easily. When I told her about the strange water temperatures and the jelly-like substance, she didn't laugh or dismiss me. She just said, "I'll be there tomorrow." Next was Kevin Morris, one of the newer rangers who had transferred from Yosemite. Kevin's a good guy, but he's skeptical about anything that doesn't have a clear scientific explanation. He didn't believe me when I mentioned the lights or the singing, but he agreed to join the team anyway. "Probably just some weird algae bloom," he said with a shrug. Joseph Running Bear was my third call. He's not a scientist or a ranger, but he knows this land better than anyone. When I told him about the footprints and the jelly, he got quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The old warnings are true, you need to be careful." Joseph agreed to help us, but he made it clear that whatever was happening wasn't something we could fight with logic alone. The last person to join was Diane Fisher, a meteorologist who had been tracking unusual weather patterns around Crater Lake for weeks. She'd noticed strange wind shifts and temperature drops near the lake, things she couldn't explain with her equipment. By the end of the day, we had our team. We didn't know what we were up against yet, but we were ready to find out. The disappearances didn't stop. Over the next 2 nights, 3 more visitors went missing. Each time it was the same, footprints leading straight into the lake. Nothing disturbed at their campsites. The park was starting to panic. Karen told us to keep things quiet, but rumors were spreading fast. People were scared, and I couldn't blame them. On the 3rd night, we set up security cameras near the shoreline to see if we could catch anything. What we saw chilled me to the bone. The footage showed one of the missing hikers standing by the water, staring at something we couldn't see. Then, faint lights appeared on the surface of the lake, soft and glowing, almost hypnotic. The hiker stepped forward, one slow step at a time, until he was waist-deep in the water. Then he disappeared beneath the surface without a struggle. We reviewed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. Kevin was convinced it was some kind of optical illusion or natural phenomenon. Patricia said it could be bioluminescent organisms reacting to changes in the water. But Joseph shook his head and said, "They sir being called." That same night, Joseph found strange symbols carved into trees around the lake's edge, symbols that matched the petroglyphs he'd shown me years ago. They looked like spirals and stars, etched deep into the bark as if someone or something had been marking its territory. Meanwhile, Patricia's equipment was picking up unusual sonar readings from the deepest part of the lake. The readings showed movement, something big shifting far below the surface. "It's not a fish," she said quietly, staring at her monitor. "It's too large, and it's staying in one place." Ulantishi. Diane added to our growing unease when she showed us her weather data. The wind patterns around Crater Lake were behaving strangely, swirling in circles instead of flowing naturally. It wasn't enough to cause a storm yet, but it felt like something was building. By now, even Kevin couldn't deny that something unnatural was happening here. The lights, the symbols, the sonar, it all pointed to one thing: there was something alive in Crater Lake. And it wasn't just alive, it was watching us. We decided to take shifts keeping watch by the shoreline that night. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we all felt it. The lake wasn't just a place anymore, it felt like a presence. That night, we set up camp near the lake's edge to keep watch. The air was cold and still, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft lapping of water against the shore. It felt too quiet, like the whole park was holding its breath. I could feel the tension in the group. Even Kevin, who had been dismissive before, was unusually quiet. We took turns keeping watch in pairs. Around midnight, it was my turn with Kevin. We sat by the fire, our flashlights aimed toward the lake, scanning for any movement. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just as I was starting to think it would be another uneventful night, I saw them, lights. They started as faint glimmers beneath the water, like tiny stars moving just below the surface. Slowly, they grew brighter and began to rise. I nudged Kevin and pointed toward the lake. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the glowing lights. "What? What is that?" he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. Before I could answer, Kevin stood up and started walking toward the water. At first I thought he was just trying to get a closer look, but then I noticed something strange. He wasn't stopping. His steps were slow and deliberate, like he was in a trance. "Kevin," I shouted, grabbing his arm. He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the lights, and his face was blank, almost peaceful. It took all my strength to pull him back toward the fire. When I finally got him to sit down, he blinked a few times and looked around like he had just woken up from a dream. "What happened?" he asked, confused. "Why am I over here?" "You were walking toward the lake," I said. "You didn't even hear me yelling at you." Kevin looked shaken but didn't say anything else. That's when we saw them, shapes rising out of the water. At first, they looked like shimmering blobs of light, but as they got closer to shore, they began to take form. They were human-sized but jelly-like, their bodies glowing faintly in the dark. They moved slowly but deliberately, their shapes shifting with every step. Patricia grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at them. The moment the beam hit one of the creatures, it recoiled and slid back into the water. The others followed quickly after it, disappearing beneath the surface as if they had never been there. We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like hours. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew we weren't alone out here anymore. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Those jelly-like creatures, scouts maybe, had come out of the water like they were searching for something, or someone. The way Kevin had been drawn to the lights made it clear. Whatever was in the lake could control people, and that terrified me. I spent the day digging through old records and maps in the ranger station's archives, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I stumbled across something strange. A pattern. Every 33 years there had been reports of disappearances at Crater Lake. Hikers, campers, fishermen, all gone without a trace. The details were eerily similar. Footprints leading into the water, strange lights at night, and occasional mentions of star jelly. The last major incident had been in 1935, and before that, 1902. I took my findings to Joseph. He listened quietly as I explained the pattern, then nodded like he already knew what I was going to say. "The elders warned us about this," he said. "They called it the depth dweller, a being that came from the stars when the volcano formed the lake. It sleeps for decades but wakes to feed." Joseph showed me petroglyphs carved into rocks near his home. They depicted spirals, stars, and figures walking into water, the same symbols he sipped found on the trees near the lake. "It's Sip's not just a legend," he said. "It's Sip's real." Meanwhile, Patricia was analyzing water samples she'd collected near Wizard Island. She found traces of an unknown element, something not found anywhere else on Earth. "This could be extraterrestrial," she said softly, her voice tinged with awe and fear. Diane added another piece to the puzzle. Her weather data showed that the unusual wind patterns around Crater Lake were growing stronger, almost like they were circling a specific point, the deepest part of the lake. By now we had a theory. Whatever was in Crater Lake wasn't just waking up. It was preparing for something big, feeding cycle or not. It was clear we didn't have much time before things got worse. As we sat around the table that evening, staring at maps and data, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by people, but by something ancient and hungry. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was clear, and the next, dark clouds rolled in over Crater Lake, bringing howling winds and sheets of rain. It felt unnatural, like the storm wasn't just weather, it was part of something bigger, something alive. We were holed up in the ranger station, watching the lake through the windows. The water was glowing faintly, the same eerie light we'd seen before, but this time it was stronger. The glow spread across the surface, pulsing like a heartbeat. None of us said a word. We just watched, frozen in place. Then we saw them. The scouts. Dozens of them emerged from the water, their jelly-like bodies shimmering in the rain. They moved toward us slowly but with purpose, surrounding the station. Their glowing forms cast strange shadows on the walls, making it feel like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. Diane was the first to panic. "We have to get out of here," she shouted, grabbing her jacket and heading for the door. Before we could stop her, she ran outside into the storm. The moment she stepped off the porch, one of the scouts reached out with a tendril-like arm and wrapped it around her waist. She screamed as it pulled her toward the lake. We tried to save her, God knows we tried. But it was too late. The scout dragged her into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. The glow around the lake grew brighter after that, as if whatever was down there had absorbed her. And then it rose. The water at the center of the lake began to churn violently, creating waves that crashed against the shore. Slowly, something massive emerged from the depths. A shape so large it seemed impossible. It wasn't solid like a creature you'd expect to see on land. It was amorphous, shifting constantly like liquid given form. Its body glowed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the storm. We stared in horror as it towered over the lake, its presence overwhelming. This was no myth or legend. This was real. The depth dweller had awakened. "We can stay here," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling. But where could we go? There was no escaping something this big, something this ancient. The depth dweller loomed over the lake, its glowing, shifting form casting eerie light across the ranger station. The storm raged around us, but it was clear the entity wasn't just part of the lake anymore. It was alive, aware, and hunting. We didn't have much time. "We need to fight back," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There has to be a way to weaken it." Joseph nodded grimly. "The old stories say it fears the volcano, the fire and stone that created this lake. Obsidian, pumice, they serve its weakness." Patricia grabbed a geology kit from her bag and pulled out samples of volcanic rock we collected during earlier studies of Wizard Island. "This might work," she said, holding up a jagged piece of obsidian, "but we still need more than just rocks to stop something that big." That's when Diane's weather equipment gave us an idea. Before she was taken, she'd been experimenting with sound frequencies to study the lake's depths. Joseph remembered one of the tribal rituals used drums and chants to disrupt the entity's influence. If we could amplify certain frequencies using Diane's equipment, maybe we could force the depth dweller back into the water. Kevin volunteered to help rig up the speakers near the shoreline, while Patricia and I worked on crafting weapons from obsidian and pumice shards. Joseph began preparing a ritual chant to focus our efforts. We were running on adrenaline and fear, but somehow we managed to pull everything together. As Kevin set up the last speaker, he turned to me with a determined look in his eyes. "If this doesn't work," he said, "I said I'll take the boat out there myself and finish it." I didn't want him to go through with it, but deep down I knew he was serious. We started the sound broadcast just as the depth dweller began moving toward shore. The frequencies were low and steady at first, then louder and sharper as Patricia adjusted the controls. The entity recoiled slightly, its glowing patterns flickering like it was struggling to maintain its form. Kevin saw his chance. He loaded a small boat with explosives we'd scavenged from old park supplies and steered it straight toward the center of the lake. "Stay back," he shouted as he sped toward the entity. The explosion rocked the lake, sending waves crashing against the shore. The depth dweller's form wavered violently before retreating into the depths. It wasn't destroyed. We knew that, but it was weakened enough for us to force it into dormancy using the sound frequencies. We survived, but not without loss. The explosion left the lake eerily quiet. The depth dweller had retreated, its glowing form sinking back into the depths, but the water still churned like it was alive. Kevin's sacrifice had bought us time, but it didn't feel like a victory. We stood on the shore, soaked from rain and shaking from exhaustion, staring at the spot where the boat had gone up in flames. "He didn't have to do that," Patricia whispered, her voice breaking. "We could found another way." "No," Joseph said firmly. He knew what he was doing. The dweller would have taken us all if he hadn't acted. I felt a lump in my throat as I looked out at the lake. Kevin had been skeptical of all this from the start, but when it mattered most, he'd put himself on the line to save us. I'd seen bravery before during my time in Vietnam. But this was different. This was selfless. We weren't done yet. The depth dweller wasn't dead. It was just dormant. Patricia and I worked quickly to set up underwater speakers around Wizard Island, broadcasting the disruptive frequencies we discovered. The sounds seemed to keep the entity contained, forcing it deeper into the lake where it couldn't reach us. Joseph performed his ritual chant by the shoreline, calling on the spirits of the land to seal the dweller's influence. I don't know if it worked in a literal sense, but it gave us hope, and sometimes that's enough. By dawn, the storm had passed and the lake returned to its usual calm, but none of us could look at it the same way again. We knew what was down there now, waiting for its next chance to rise. The official report labeled everything as tragic drownings and weather-related accidents. Karen made sure none of our findings about the depth dweller made it into public records. She said it was for our own good, that no one would believe us anyway. I was forced into early retirement soon after that. They called me unstable for insisting there was something dangerous in Crater Lake. Patricia stayed behind to continue her research quietly, while Joseph arranged for tribal members to keep watch over the lake. As for me, I moved into a small cabin overlooking Crater Lake, spending my days installing equipment and monitoring the water for signs of movement. I know it'll come back, maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday. And when it does, I'll be ready. It's been months since that night at Crater Lake, but the memories haven't faded. I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing echoes of Diane's scream or seeing Kevin's determined face as he steered that boat toward the depth dweller. Some nights, I dream about the glowing lights beneath the water, soft and mesmerizing, pulling me closer and closer until I wake up gasping for air. The park moved on quickly, as places like this tend to do. Tourists returned, snapping photos of the lake's beauty, completely unaware of what lies beneath. The official reports made it sound like nothing more than a series of tragic accidents, a storm, some drownings, and a ranger who lost his way. No one talks about the lights or the jelly-like creatures or the massive entity that rose from the depths. It's like it never happened. But I know better. Patricia stayed at Crater Lake to continue her research in secret. She sends me updates sometimes, strange sonar readings, unusual water samples, small signs that the depth dweller is still down there, waiting. Joseph keeps his people close to the lake, performing rituals and watching for signs of its return. He says it'll be another 33 years before it wakes up again, but I'm not so sure. As for me, I couldn't leave Crater Lake behind. It feels like my responsibility now, like I owe it to Kevin and everyone else who vanished, to make sure no one else falls victim to whatever's lurking in those waters. I bought a small cabin overlooking the lake and filled it with equipment, cameras, sensors, sound monitors, all aimed at keeping watch. Every morning, I walk down to the shore and scan the water for anything unusual. Sometimes I think I see faint lights flickering beneath the surface, but they disappear before I can get a closer look. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it's a warning. The depth dweller isn't gone, it's just resting. And when it wakes up again, I'll be here, watching. The final scene plays out quietly. Me sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, staring at Crater Lake as the sun rises over its calm surface. It looks peaceful now, but I know better. My name is Raymond Martinez. I'm 47 years old, a former Marine sniper, and now a park ranger in the Coconino National Forest in Arizona. People say I'm good at what I do, tracking, navigating, keeping the forest safe, but honestly, I came here to escape. After the war, I couldn't handle cities anymore. Too loud, too crowded. Out here, among the ponderosa pines, it's quiet, peaceful, or at least it used to be. This morning started like any other. I climbed up to my fire lookout tower just before sunrise. The view from up there is breathtaking. Miles of endless trees stretching out like a green ocean. The air smelled fresh, with a hint of pine sap carried by the breeze. I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched the sun slowly rise, painting the forest in shades of gold and orange. But something felt off. The birds were acting strange. Normally they'd be chirping and flitting about, but today they were flying in tight groups, heading south like they were running from something. I made a note of it in my journal. It's part of my job to track wildlife patterns, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant trouble. Trouble wasn't new around here. Just last week, 3 hikers went missing. Separate groups, no connection between them. The sheriff's office sent out search teams, but found nothing except their abandoned campsites. It's not uncommon for people to get lost in these woods, They're vast and unforgiving if you don't know your way around. But 3 in 1 week, that's unusual. As I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I noticed something else. A deer carcass lying near the edge of the clearing. Its body was drained of blood and cut open with surgical precision. No claw marks, no bite marks, nothing that screamed predator attack. It was just wrong. I radioed my supervisor about it, but he brushed it off as probably a mountain lion. I've seen mountain lion kills before. This wasn't one of them. Still, he told me to keep an eye out and join the search party later that afternoon. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of something far more terrifying than anything I'd ever faced, even during the war. By noon, I was heading to the ranger station to meet the search party. My supervisor had put together a small team to look for the missing hikers. The group wasn't exactly what I'd call ideal, but we didn't have much of a choice. There was Dr. Eleanor Weiss, a wildlife biologist who'd been studying pine beetle infestations in the area. She was sharp, no nonsense, and carried a backpack full of gear that looked like it belonged in a science lab. Then there was Thomas Begay, a Navajo guide who'd worked in these woods for decades. He didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. Finally, there was Frank Delgado, a young deputy sheriff who seemed more interested in proving himself than actually helping. He kept cracking jokes and rolling his eyes whenever Thomas mentioned local legends or warnings about the forest. We started by checking one of the hikers' last known locations, a campsite deep in the woods. It took us hours to get there, hiking through uneven trails and dense underbrush. The forest felt different today. The air was heavier, like it was pressing down on us, and the usual sounds, birds, squirrels, wind rustling through the trees, were gone. It was too quiet. When we reached the campsite, it looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry. The tent was half collapsed, and gear was scattered everywhere, pots, pans, even a pair of hiking boots lying on their side. Eleanor found a journal near the fire pit and flipped through it while Thomas examined the area for tracks. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, holding up the journal. "The live keep seeing eyes in the trees at night. They don't set blink. Sep." She looked up at me, her face pale. "What do you think they meant by that?" I didn't answer right away because Thomas called us over to look at something he'd found carved into one of the trees. Strange symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, really old, and were etched deep into the bark like someone wanted them to last forever. "Warnings," Thomas muttered under his breath. "Warnings about what?" Frank asked with a smirk. Thomas didn't reply, but his expression said enough. The strangest thing we found was an old camera with film still inside. Eleanor carefully removed it and promised to develop the photos back at her cabin later that evening. But even without seeing what was on them, I could feel it, the sense that we were being watched. Frank laughed off our unease and said we were letting ghost stories get to us. "It's probably just some nut job messing around out here," he said as he kicked over an empty water bottle lying near the tent. But I wasn't so sure. Something about this place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here. The deeper we went into the forest, the stranger things got. Thomas kept finding more of those symbols carved into trees, each one more elaborate than the last. He didn't say much about them, but I could tell by the way his jaw tightened every time he saw one that they weren't good news. The weather started turning against us too. Dark clouds rolled in out of nowhere, and the wind picked up, making the tall pines sway like they were alive. Eleanor checked her GPS and said we were heading toward an area called Mogollon Ridge. I'd heard of it before, a remote part of the forest where hikers sometimes disappeared without a trace. Locals avoided it, calling it cursed or haunted. I never paid much attention to those stories before, but now I wasn't so sure. By late afternoon, we stumbled across something that made my stomach drop, a tree with claw marks running down its trunk. They were deep and jagged like something big had raked its talons across it. But what really got me was the height of the marks. They started at least 8 feet off the ground. What kind of animal could do that? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not one I've ever seen," I replied, gripping my brother's hunting knife tighter in my hand. Thomas muttered something in Navajo under his breath and pointed to the ground. There were tracks, huge ones, leading away from the tree. They looked human, but wrong. The toes were too long, and they dug deep into the soil like whatever made them was heavy. Frank snorted and shook his head. "It's just a bear," he said, even though we all knew it wasn't. The wind picked up again, and thunder rumbled in the distance. We decided to take shelter in an old cabin. Thomas knew about nearby. It was small and run down, with a sagging roof and windows covered in grime, but it was better than being stuck outside during a storm. That night, as rain pounded against the roof and lightning lit up the sky, we heard it. The voices. At first, it sounded like someone calling for help from deep in the woods. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was shaky, desperate. Frank jumped up and grabbed his flashlight. "That's gotta be one of the hikers," he said, heading for the door. "Wait," Thomas shouted, grabbing Frank Sip's arm. "Don Sip, go out there." "What Sip's your problem?" Frank snapped back. "Someone needs help." Thomas Sip's face was grim as he said, "That Sip's not them." Before anyone could argue, another voice joined in, a woman this time. "Please help me." It sounded close enough to touch, but far enough to make your skin crawl. Eleanor backed away from the window, her face pale as a sheet. "Raymond, those voices, they sound like they're coming from everywhere," I finished for her. Frank wasn't listening anymore. He yanked open the door and stepped outside into the rain with his flashlight pointed toward the trees. "Frank," I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. The rest of us stayed inside, frozen in place as more voices joined in. A chorus of cries for help echoing through the forest like ghosts trapped between worlds. And then, silence. When Frank finally came back hours later, he wasn't set himself anymore. He was soaked to the bone and shaking like a leaf, his flashlight dangling uselessly from his hand. His eyes stared blankly at nothing, as he muttered over and over again, "It's Seps watching us. It's Seps watching us." Frank didn't say another word after that. He just sat in the corner of the cabin, staring at the ceiling like he was trying to see something none of us could. No matter how much we asked him what happened out there, he wouldn't answer. It was like his mind had shut down completely. The storm finally eased up by morning, but the air felt heavier than before, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We packed up and decided to keep moving, though none of us felt good about it. Thomas led the way, his eyes scanning every shadow and movement around us. It wasn't long before we found something that made my stomach churn, a cave entrance hidden behind a cluster of boulders. The opening was narrow and jagged, like the earth had split apart to make room for it. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks when he saw it, his face pale. "This isn't set right," he said quietly. Eleanor crouched down and pointed to carvings etched into the stone around the entrance, symbols similar to the ones we seen on the trees. "These look ancient," she said, running her fingers over them, like they've been here for centuries. I didn't want to go inside, but something told me we had no choice. If we were going to find out what happened to those hikers and what was stalking us, we had to see where this led. The cave was cold and damp, with walls that seemed to close in tighter the farther we went. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that danced like they were alive. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn. And then we saw them, the bodies. They weren't just dead, they were hollowed out, their insides replaced with some kind of amber-like substance that glistened in the flashlight beams. Their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror, their mouths open as if they'd died screaming. Eleanor gasped and covered her mouth, while Thomas muttered something in Navajo under his breath again. Even Frank, who hadn't spoken since last night, let out a low whimper. What could do this?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Thomas turned to us, his expression grim. "The whisper," he said simply. I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He explained as best he could, about an ancient creature from Navajo legends called the Mogollon Whisperer. According to the stories, it stalks its prey for days, feeding on their fear before finally killing them. It's said to mimic voices perfectly and can camouflage itself so well, it's practically invisible among the trees. "Can it be killed?" Eleanor asked. Thomas hesitated before answering, "Only with weapons made from lightning-struck wood." I glanced at my brother's hunting knife in my hand and felt a pang of doubt. It wasn't made from lightning-struck wood, just steel and leather, and I wasn't sure it would do much against something like this. Before we could say anything else, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees outside the cave entrance at impossible speeds. I froze and tightened my grip on my knife as Eleanor whispered, "Did you see that?" "Yeah," I replied quietly. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, but stopped short when a sound echoed through the cave, a voice calling out from somewhere deep inside. It was faint at first, but grew louder with each passing second until it sounded like it was right next to us. "Help me." It was Thomas Sip's voice. Hearing Thomas's voice echo through the cave sent chills down my spine. But the problem was, Thomas was standing right next to me. His face went pale, and his hand tightened around the walking stick he carried. "That's not me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us moved. The voice called out again, this time sounding more desperate. "Please, help me." It was identical to Thomas's voice, down to the gravelly tone and slight accent. Eleanor backed up until she hit the cave wall, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Raymond? What is that?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that we needed to get out of that cave fast. We scrambled back outside, but the forest didn't feel any safer. The trees seemed taller somehow, their shadows stretching longer than they should have in the afternoon light. The air was thick and humid, making it hard to breathe. Thomas stopped suddenly and pointed to a fallen tree nearby. Its trunk had been split clean in half, and its bark was blackened like it had been struck by lightning. He turned to me and said, "This is what we need." I understood immediately. If the legends were true, and at this point I wasn't about to argue, we needed weapons made from lightning-struck wood to stand a chance against whatever was hunting us. We worked quickly, stripping branches and sharpening them into crude spears with Eleanor's multi-tool. Frank didn't help. He just sat on the ground muttering to himself about something watching him from the treetops. I wanted to shake him out of it, but there wasn't time. As night fell, we set up camp near a clearing with a view of the river below. Thomas said running water might keep the creature away for a while, but none of us felt safe, not even close. That night, Thomas volunteered for first watch while the rest of us tried to get some sleep. I didn't think I'd be able to close my eyes, but exhaustion won out eventually. When I woke up hours later, it was because Eleanor was shaking me awake. Her face panicked. "Raymond," she whispered urgently. "Thomas is gone." I jumped up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the camp. His walking stick was lying on the ground near where he'd been sitting, but there was no sign of him anywhere else. "Thomas," I shouted into the darkness. No answer. And then we heard it, his voice calling out from somewhere deep in the forest. "Over here." It sounded calm at first, almost reassuring. But then it changed. "Help me." The words stretched unnaturally long, like they were being pulled apart by something cruel and hungry. Eleanor grabbed my arm tightly as her voice trembled. "Raymond, that Sip's not him." I knew she was right because Thomas would never leave us like this, not without saying something first. The whisper had taken him. After Thomas disappeared, the forest felt different, like it was alive and watching us. Every sound, every shadow seemed sharper, closer. Eleanor and I didn't say much as we packed up camp. Even Frank, who had been nearly catatonic for hours, started mumbling again. He kept saying things like, "It's in the trees, and it knows we're here." We tried to keep moving, heading toward the river canyon Thomas had mentioned earlier. Eleanor said running water might confuse the creature or block whatever senses it used to track us. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. The voices started again as we hiked. At first, they were faint, just whispers carried on the wind, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. "Raymond." I froze mid-step when I heard my name. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It sounded like my brother, the brother I lost in the war. "Raymond, why didn't Set you save me?" My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. I hadn't thought about him in years, not like this. But hearing his voice brought everything back, the battlefield, the explosion, the way he looked at me before he died. Eleanor grabbed my arm, and shook me hard. "Raymond, it's Sep's not real." Her voice snapped me out of it, but my hands were still shaking as I gripped my knife tighter. The whisper wasn't just hunting us. It was playing with us, digging into our minds and pulling out our worst fears. Frank wasn't Sep so lucky. He collapsed to his knees and started sobbing uncontrollably as another voice called out to him. A woman's Sep's voice this time. "Frank, why did you leave me?" Eleanor crouched next to him and tried to pull him back to his feet, but he wouldn't move. "Frank, listen to me." "It's lying," she shouted. But Frank couldn't hear her anymore. The voices kept coming. Thomas's voice, my brother's voice, even Eleanor's voice at one point, and they were relentless. By the time we reached the river canyon, we were all on edge, jumping at every sound and shadow. Eleanor stopped suddenly and pointed to something ahead, a narrow bridge made of old wood stretching across the river below. It looked unstable, but it was our only way forward. "We need to cross," she said firmly. I nodded and stepped onto the bridge first, testing each plank carefully before moving forward. The water rushed loudly beneath us, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that maybe we'd be safe on the other side. But then I heard it again. My brother Sep's voice. "Raymond, you can Sep run forever." I turned quickly, shining my flashlight behind us, and that's when I saw it. The Whisperer. It was standing at the edge of the forest just beyond the bridge, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. Its body was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin, like its bones were barely holding it together. Its skin shimmered faintly in the moonlight, blending perfectly with its surroundings except for its eyes, black pits that seemed to swallow all light around them. It didn't move right away. It just stood there, watching us with its head tilted slightly to one side, like it was studying us. And then it spoke. "Help me." It used Thomas's voice again, but this time there was no mistaking how wrong it sounded, stretched out and hollow like something pretending to be human. Eleanor gasped behind me as Frank let out a terrified scream and bolted back toward the forest. "Frank, no," Eleanor shouted after him. But it was too late. The Whisperer moved faster than anything I'd ever seen before, disappearing into the trees after him in an instant. Frank's scream cut through the night like a knife, and then it was gone, swallowed by the forest. Eleanor and I stood frozen on the bridge, staring at the spot where the Whisperer had disappeared. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "We can go after him," Eleanor said quietly, her voice trembling. "It's Sep's too late." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew she was right. Frank was gone, just like Thomas. If we didn't focus on surviving, we'd be next. We crossed the bridge quickly and found ourselves in a clearing on the other side. The rain started again, not heavy, but steady enough to soak through our clothes and make the ground slick. Eleanor pointed to a cluster of lightning-struck trees near the edge of the clearing. "That sips it," she said. "We can use those." We worked quickly, breaking off branches and sharpening them into spears as best we could. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped mine twice, but Eleanor kept me focused. Her calm determination was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. "We need to draw it out," she said once we were ready. "If it sends hunting us, we can use that against it." I nodded, though every part of me wanted to run as far away from this place as possible, but running wouldn't work. Not against something like this. Eleanor stepped into the center of the clearing and shouted into the darkness. "Come on, we're right here." Her voice echoed through the trees, bold and defiant. For a moment, nothing happened. The rain kept falling, and the forest stayed eerily quiet. And then we saw it. The Whisperer emerged from the shadows slowly this time, its movements deliberate and unsettling. It was taller than I remembered, at least 10 feet now, and its translucent skin shimmered faintly in the rain. Its jaw hung open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed too large for its mouth. It didn't rush us like before. Instead, it moved closer inch by inch, its black eyes locked onto us like a predator sizing up its prey. Eleanor raised her spear and shouted again, "Come on." The creature tilted its head slightly, almost as if it understood her challenge, and then it lunged. I barely had time to react before it was on us, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Eleanor swung her spear and managed to graze its side, but it didn't slow down. It knocked her to the ground with one swipe of its elongated arm and turned its attention to me. I raised my spear just as it lunged again, aiming for my chest. The force of its attack sent me sprawling backward into the mud, but I managed to hold onto my weapon. Its teeth snapped inches from my face as I drove the spear upward with everything I had. The tip pierced its chest with a sickening crunch, and for a moment, everything went still. The whisperer let out a sound I'll never forget. A high-pitched screech that echoed through the forest like nails on a chalkboard. Its body began to crystallize around the wound, spreading outward until its entire form was covered in jagged amber-like shards. And then it shattered. Pieces of its body rained down around me as I lay there gasping for air. The rain washed away the shards quickly, leaving nothing behind except silence. I scrambled to my feet and ran to Eleanor's side. She was bleeding badly from a gash on her leg, but still conscious. "Raymond," she whispered weakly. "Is it gone?" I nodded, though I wasn't so sure if I believed it myself. Yeah, it's gone." The forest was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow, like something had been taken from it. Or maybe something had been left behind. I helped Eleanor to her feet, wrapping her arm around my shoulder to keep her steady. She winced with every step, but she didn't complain. We crossed back over the bridge, careful not to look too long at the shadows in the trees. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by now, and the river below roared louder than ever. I kept my spear close, even though the whisperer was gone, or at least I hoped it was. When we reached the other side, we found Frank's flashlight lying in the mud near the edge of the clearing. It was still on, its beam pointing uselessly into the darkness. But Frank wasn't there, just silence and empty space where he'd been. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Do you think it took him?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. We made our way back to the ranger station slowly, stopping every few minutes to catch our breath or check for movement in the trees. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to rise again, casting pale light over the forest. It should have felt comforting, but it didn't. Not after what we'd seen. The sheriff met us at the station with a team of deputies and medics. They patched up Eleanor's leg and asked us what happened out there where Frank and Thomas were, why we looked like we'd been through hell. I told them about the whisperer, about the voices, the cave, and how it hunted us like nothing I'd ever seen before. But they didn't believe me. They said it was probably a bear attack or maybe a mountain lion that got spooked by the storm. "Bears don't hollow out bodies," I told them flatly. The sheriff just shook his head and muttered something about filing a report later. Eleanor didn't say much after that. She sat quietly in one of the medic's trucks, staring out at the forest like she was waiting for something or someone to come back. As for me, I stayed behind at my post. The thought of leaving crossed my mind more than once, but I couldn't do it. Not after everything that happened. Something told me this wasn't over, that whatever we killed wasn't alone out there. A week later, I climbed back up to my fire lookout tower early in the morning. The forest looked normal again, birds chirping, squirrels darting between branches, but it didn't feel normal. It felt like it was hiding something. As I watched hikers enter the trailhead below, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind, I heard it again, the whispers. They were faint at first, but grew louder as they drifted through the trees like ghosts trapped between worlds. "Raymond." I froze, gripping my brother's hunting knife tightly in my hand as my heart pounded in my chest. The forest was watching me. My name is Victoria Holt. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. Most people think my job is peaceful, just hiking trails, helping tourists, and keeping an eye on wildlife. But the truth is, it can be dangerous. I'm also part of the search and rescue team, which means when someone gets lost or hurt out here, it's my job to bring them back. Sometimes, though, you don't always succeed. It's been a tough year for me. Last winter, during a rescue mission, I couldn't save a little boy who had fallen into a frozen ravine. I tried everything I could, but the snowstorm was too strong, and by the time we reached him, it was too late. His parents blamed me, and honestly, I blame myself too. That failure has been haunting me ever since. Today started like any other spring day in the park. The snow was melting earlier than usual this year, and the trails were muddy but manageable. I was patrolling the Paradise Trail, one of the most popular routes for hikers and climbers heading toward Mount Rainier's summit. The air was crisp, and the sun was shining bright. It felt like nature was waking up after a long winter's sleep. But something felt off. As I walked along the trail, I noticed strange marks on some of the trees. They weren't scratches or claw marks like you'd expect from bears or cougars. These trees were broken, snapped cleanly about 15 or 20 feet up, way higher than any animal could reach. It wasn't just one or two trees either. There were several scattered along the trail in odd patterns. I stopped to take a closer look and felt a chill run down my spine. The breaks were too clean to be caused by wind or fallen branches. It looked like someone or something had done this deliberately, but what kind of creature could break trees that high up? As I continued my patrol, I noticed something else strange. Mist forming in the valleys below. Normally, mist is common in the mornings or after rainstorms, but today was clear and sunny, not a cloud in sight, and yet this mist seemed to be creeping up from nowhere. It wasn't natural. It moved like it had a mind of its own, swirling and shifting as if it were alive. I shook off the uneasy feeling and reminded myself that nature can be unpredictable sometimes. Still, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me out there in the woods. Later that afternoon, I got a call on the radio from my supervisor, Mark. His voice sounded tense. "Victoria, we've got a situation," he said. 4 climbers went missing on the summit route. Experienced guys' last radio contact was hours ago. They said something about mist and movement before the signal cut out. I felt my stomach drop. Missing climbers are always serious, but this sounded different, stranger. I didn't hesitate to volunteer for the search team, even though Mark hesitated before agreeing. "Are you sure you set her up for this?" he asked carefully. "After last winter." "Incept fine," I said firmly, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. I find them. The search team was small but solid. Dr. Marcus Powell, a geologist in his late 50s who was studying volcanic activity in the park, James Hopkins, one of our rangers and an old climbing partner of mine, and Angie Weston, a wildlife photographer who had been documenting wolverines in the area. James and I had history years ago. We'd been close, maybe too close, but my job always came first, and he couldn't handle the risks I took every day. We drifted apart, though we still worked well together when it mattered. We packed our gear quickly: ropes, ice axes, avalanche beacons, and enough food to last for a few days if needed. The weather was clear for now, but in the mountains, that could change in an instant. As we climbed higher into the park's wilderness, the mist started creeping back again, not thick enough to block our view entirely, but just enough to make everything feel eerie. It clung to the valleys like smoke and seemed to follow us as we moved along the trail. Angie pointed out strange signs along the way. More broken trees forming odd shapes like circles or triangles. "This isn't set natural," she muttered, snapping photos with her camera. "Whatever Sep's doing this, it Sep's big." James tried to lighten the mood with jokes about Bigfoot or aliens, but no one laughed. Even Marcus seemed unusually quiet as he studied the ground for signs of volcanic activity or landslides that might explain the mist. By nightfall, we reached the climbers' high camp near Emmons Glacier, the last place they'd been seen before disappearing. What we found there made my heart race. The camp was in total disarray, tents shredded, sleeping bags tossed around like rag dolls, and equipment scattered everywhere. It didn't look like an avalanche or rockfall had hit. It looked like something had torn through with brute force. Marcus crouched near a patch of half-frozen mud and called us over. "Look at this," he said quietly. It was a footprint, huge and deep, with toes like a human's but far too large to belong to any person. The sight of it sent shivers down my spine. Our radios crackled suddenly with faint voices, fragments of what sounded like the climber's last transmission. "It seps in the mist, moving can sep see." Then silence. We exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't say much as we set up our own camp nearby. The air felt heavy with tension, like something was watching us from just beyond the edge of the mist. That night, the four of us sat around a small campfire, barely speaking. The flames flickered weakly in the damp air, and the mist seemed to press closer with every passing hour. It wasn't thick enough to block our view entirely, but it felt alive like it was watching us. Angie was fiddling with her camera, scrolling through photos she sipped taken earlier. These patterns in the trees, they sip too precise, she said quietly. It sips like something sips marking its territory. James poked at the fire with a stick, his face grim. Maybe it's just storm damage, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. I didn't say anything. I was too busy thinking about that footprint we'd found. It was still fresh in my mind, too big to be human, too strange to belong to any animal I knew of. As the fire died down, we decided to get some rest before continuing the search in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig made my heart race. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. Something was wrong. The mist had grown thicker, swirling around our camp like a living thing. Our flashlights barely cut through it, and the air felt colder than before. Then we heard it. A low guttural growl coming from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't loud, but it was deep enough to make my chest vibrate. What was that? Angie whispered, clutching her camera like it could protect her. We all froze, straining our ears for any other sounds. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a strange cracking noise, like trees being snapped in half. James grabbed his rifle and motioned for us to stay quiet. Stay here, he whispered, but I shook my head and followed him as he crept toward the edge of the camp. We didn't see anything at first, just more mist and shadows, but then something moved. It was fast and massive, darting between the trees like a ghost. I caught only a glimpse, a hulking shape covered in dark fur with long arms that swung as it moved upright on two legs. Did you see that? James hissed, his voice shaking. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. When we returned to camp, Marcus was standing near the fire pit with a strange look on his face. He pointed to the ground where another footprint had appeared overnight, this one even larger than the first. We said we're not alone out here, he said quietly. The rest of the night passed in tense silence as we huddled close together, listening to the sounds of something moving just beyond our sight. The next morning, the mist hadn't lifted. It hung low over the ground, swirling lazily like it was waiting for us to make a move. None of us had slept much, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Angie was the first to speak as we packed up our gear. Whatever's out here, it's not just some animal. It's smart, she said, her voice trembling. James didn't respond, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He kept glancing at the tree line like he expected something to burst out at any moment. We decided to head toward a ravine where the climbers might have taken shelter. The terrain was rough, steep slopes covered in loose rocks and patches of snow that hadn't melted yet. The mist made everything worse, cutting off our view and making it hard to tell where we were going. As we moved deeper into the wilderness, Angie kept snapping photos of the strange patterns in the trees and ground. At one point, she stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. Look at that, she whispered. We all turned to see what she was pointing at, a cluster of trees broken into a perfect spiral shape, with their jagged ends pointing inward like arrows. It was unnatural, eerie, and completely silent around it. Marcus knelt down to examine the ground near the spiral. No signs of an avalanche or rockfall, he muttered. This wasn't sit caused by nature. Before we could say anything else, the mist thickened again, so fast it felt like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, Angie screamed. We spun around, but she was gone. Angie, I shouted, my voice echoing through the fog. We ran toward where she'd been standing just seconds ago, but there was no sign of her, no footprints, no movement, nothing. Then James spotted something lying on the ground, her camera. I picked it up with shaking hands and scrolled through the last few photos she'd taken. My stomach turned as I saw them, blurry images of something massive moving upright in the mist. The last photo was clear enough to make out a shadowy figure with long arms and glowing eyes staring straight at her. We searched frantically for hours, calling her name and combing through the area, but eventually we found her, or what was left of her. Her body was halfway up a tall pine tree, hanging limply from one of its branches like a broken doll. Her chest cavity was empty, completely hollowed out, and her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. Marcus turned away and vomited into the bushes while James stood there shaking his head in disbelief. "We need to leave," James said firmly, his voice cracking. "Whatever this thing is, we're not prepared for it." But I couldn't leave, not yet. Angie's death only made me more determined to find those climbers and figure out what was happening in this forest. "We're not going anywhere," I said sharply. "Not until we finish what we came here to do." James stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but he didn't argue. Marcus wiped his mouth and nodded weakly, though I could tell he wanted nothing more than to run back down the mountain. As we moved forward into the mist again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted and that Angie wouldn't be the last. We pressed on, but the forest felt heavier with every step. The mist was thicker now, wrapping around us like a blanket. It muffled every sound, and even the crunch of our boots on the snow seemed quieter. James was on edge, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, his breathing shallow. I tried to stay focused, but Angie's hollowed-out body haunted me. Whatever had done that wasn't just dangerous, it was cruel. The ravine was steep and rocky, with patches of ice clinging to the edges. As we descended carefully, the air grew colder, and the mist seemed to pulse, moving like it was alive. Then we heard it. A wet, crunching sound, coming from somewhere below us. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Something was eating. James held up a hand to stop us and pointed toward a cluster of boulders at the bottom of the ravine. We crouched low and moved slowly, trying not to make any noise. When we rounded the last boulder, we saw it, and my breath caught in my throat. The creature was massive, at least 10 feet tall, with patchy fur that looked matted and dirty. Its body was hunched over a mountain goat it had killed, tearing into its flesh with long claws and teeth that gleamed in the dim light. It wasn't just its size that terrified me, it was its face. It looked almost human, with deep-set eyes that glowed faintly in the mist and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide as it ate. Marcus let out a strangled gasp, and the creature froze. Its head snapped up, and it turned to look directly at us. Those glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then it stood up, slowly, and I realized just how big it really was. Its arms hung low like an ape's, but its movements were deliberate and intelligent. This wasn't some mindless animal. It knew exactly what we were. James raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air to scare it off. Big mistake. The creature let out a roar that shook the ground beneath our feet, a sound so deep and guttural it felt like it was inside my chest. The mist thickened instantly, swirling around us so fast I could barely see James or Marcus anymore. "Run," James shouted. But before I could move, I felt something in my head, a wave of fear so intense it nearly knocked me over. It wasn't just panic or adrenaline. It was like the creature was inside my mind, twisting my thoughts and making me see things that weren't real. I saw the boy from last winter, the one I couldn't save, standing in front of me with tears streaming down his face. "You let me die," he whispered. I blinked hard and shook my head, trying to snap out of it. "It's not real," I muttered to myself. "It's not real." When I finally broke free of the hallucination, Marcus was gone. "Marcus!" I shouted into the mist, but there was no answer, just the faint sound of rocks tumbling down the ravine. James grabbed my arm and pulled me away from where the creature had been standing moments ago. "We have to go," he yelled. But I couldn't leave Marcus behind, not without trying to find him first. We searched for hours in the mist, calling his name over and over again until our voices were hoarse. Eventually, we found him, or what was left of him, at the bottom of a cliff. His body was twisted unnaturally on the rocks below, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. James stared down at him for a long moment before turning away. "This thing is going to kill us all," he he said quietly. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could think about was how close we'd come to dying ourselves and how much worse things were going to get if we didn't figure out how to stop this creature. After Marcus's death, James and I didn't say much. We were both shaken, and the mist seemed thicker than ever, wrapping around us like it wanted to pull us in. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. We stumbled across an old research cabin late in the afternoon. It was small and weathered, tucked away in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, and the inside smelled of damp wood and mildew. James dropped his pack and slumped into a chair near the fireplace, his face pale and drawn. "We're not going to make it out of here," he muttered, staring blankly at the floor. I ignored him and started searching the cabin for supplies, anything that could help us survive or understand what we were dealing with. There were shelves lined with dusty books, old maps pinned to the walls, and a stack of yellowed papers on a desk in the corner. One of the papers caught my eye. It was covered in handwritten notes about strange disappearances in the park dating back decades. The writer described patterns of broken trees, unnatural mist, and sightings of a creature that sounded exactly like what we'd seen. The notes mentioned something else, a connection to celestial events. Every 42 years, during specific meteor showers, this creature would awaken from hibernation, disturbed by changes in its environment. The last cycle had been in 1932, which meant this year was another cycle. I flipped through more pages and found a sketch of the creature, rough but recognizable, and a note about its weakness. Moonlight. The mist it created was less effective under direct moonlight. As I read, I heard James mumbling behind me. At first I thought he was talking to himself, but when I turned around, his eyes were wide and unfocused. "It's Seps here," he whispered. "It's Seps outside." I froze and listened carefully. The mist had thickened again, swirling against the windows like smoke. The air felt colder, heavier. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound on the roof. James stood up suddenly and grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. Before I could respond, something slammed against the cabin door with enough force to rattle the walls. James let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward as the door creaked under the pressure. The tapping on the roof grew louder, more frantic, and I felt that wave of fear again, the psychic assault that made my thoughts twist into nightmares. I saw the boy again, the one I couldn't save, standing outside the cabin window with his hand pressed against the glass. His lips moved silently, but I knew what he was saying. "You let me die." James wasn't handling it any better. He started shouting at someone who wasn't there, his voice raw with anger and fear, and then he grabbed me by the shoulders. "It's Sep's your fault," he yelled, shaking me violently. "You brought us here, you killed them." I fought him off as best as I could and managed to shove him into a chair before he could drag me outside. He sat there breathing hard, his hands trembling as he stared at nothing. I didn't know how much longer we could last like this, trapped in a cabin with something hunting us outside and our own minds turning against us inside. I sat on the floor of the cabin, trying to calm my racing thoughts. James was slumped in the chair, his face pale and his breathing uneven. He hadn't said anything since his outburst, but I could tell he was still fighting whatever visions the creature had planted in his mind. The mist outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, swirling and shifting, as if it were searching for a way in. I knew we couldn't stay here forever, but I also knew we couldn't leave without a plan. I turned back to the stack of papers on the desk and started reading through them again, desperate for answers. The notes were detailed but scattered, written by someone who had clearly spent years studying the creature. One page stood out, a description of how the creature marked its territory with geometric patterns formed from broken trees. The writer believed these patterns weren't random, they were warnings to stay away. Another page explained the mist. It wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological weapon. The creature used it to disorient its prey and project fear into their minds, making them see things that weren't real. But then I found something hopeful, a note about moonlight. The writer had observed that during nights with a full moon, the mist became weaker, and the creature's movements slowed down. It seemed to rely on darkness and confusion to hunt, and moonlight disrupted that. I glanced at my watch. It was almost nightfall, and tonight's forecast called for clear skies with a full moon. If we could make it through the night, we might have a chance to fight back. I looked over at James, who was still staring blankly at the floor. "We need to use the moonlight," I said firmly, shaking him by the shoulder. He blinked slowly and turned to me, his eyes dull. "What are you talking about?" he muttered. I held up the notes. "The mist is weaker under moonlight," I explained quickly. "If we can lure it out into an open area when the moon is high, we might be able to stop it." James shook his head weakly. "You don't understand. It's not just out there, it's in here," he said, tapping his temple with trembling fingers. "I know," I said quietly, "but if we don't do something now, we're still going to die here." He didn't respond right away, but eventually he nodded, just barely, and started gathering his gear. I packed up the notes and maps along with my rifle and flashlight. As I zipped up my pack, I noticed one last page sticking out from under the stack of papers, a handwritten timeline of disappearances in Mount Rainier National Park going back over a century. Every 42 years, like clockwork, 1932, and now 2025. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some random encounter. We were caught in something much bigger than ourselves. I folded up the timeline and slipped it into my pocket before turning back to James. "Let's go," I said firmly. He nodded again, and together we stepped out into the mist, hoping that whatever waited for us wouldn't be our end. The mist was thicker than ever as James and I stepped out of the cabin. It clung to the ground like smoke, swirling around our boots with every step. The air was cold and heavy, and every sound seemed muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We didn't talk much as we moved through the trees. James looked pale and exhausted, but he gripped his rifle tightly, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead, scanning the trail for any sign of movement. The plan was simple: find an open area where the moonlight could reach us, lure the creature out, and use its weakness against it. But even as I tried to focus on the plan, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The mist seemed to pulse around us, thickening and thinning in waves. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam, a dark shape that disappeared as soon as I turned to look. Finally, we reached an exposed ridge near a glacial crevasse. The moon was rising now, its pale light cutting through the mist in silvery streaks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give us a chance. "This is it," I said quietly, setting down my pack and pulling out my rifle. James nodded silently and took up a position a few feet away from me. For a while, nothing happened. The mist swirled lazily around us, and the only sounds were the distant creaks of ice shifting in the glacier below. Then we heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I tightened my grip on my rifle as the growl grew louder, deeper, until it felt like the ground itself was vibrating. The mist thickened again, swirling faster and faster until it was almost impossible to see. "Stay calm," I whispered to James, though my heart was racing. Suddenly the creature appeared, bursting out of the mist like a nightmare made real. It was even larger than I remembered, its patchy fur gleaming in the moonlight and its glowing eyes locked onto us. It moved fast, too fast for something so big, and before I could react, it was charging straight at James. "Move!" I shouted, but he froze in place, his rifle shaking in his hands. At the last second, he fired a shot that barely grazed the creature's shoulder. It roared in fury and swiped at him with one massive arm, knocking him to the ground like a rag doll. I raised my rifle and fired 3 quick shots into its chest. It staggered but didn't fall. Its glowing eyes turned toward me now, filled with rage. I backed up slowly toward the edge of the ridge, keeping my flashlight trained on it. The moonlight seemed to slow it down slightly. Its movements were less fluid now, but it wasn't enough to stop it completely. Then I remembered the crevasse. "Come on," I muttered under my breath as I led it closer to the edge. Just a little further. The creature lunged at me again, but this time I dodged, barely, and fired another shot into its shoulder. It roared in pain and stumbled forward onto the thin ice covering the crevasse. I didn't hesitate. Raising my rifle one last time, I aimed carefully at the ice beneath its feet and pulled the trigger. The ice cracked loudly, splintering into jagged pieces that gave way under its massive weight. The creature let out one final roar as it plunged into the darkness below, disappearing into the glacier's depths. For a moment, everything was silent except for my ragged breathing. Then James groaned weakly from where he lay on the ground. He was alive, but barely. I rushed over to him and helped him sit up. His face was pale and covered in sweat, but he managed a shaky smile. "You did it?" he whispered. I didn't respond right away, partly because I wasn't sure if we'd really won. The creature was gone for now, but something told me this wasn't over. James and I made it back to the cabin just before sunrise. He was weak, barely able to walk, but alive. I patched him up as best as I could, wrapping his wounds and giving him water. He didn't say much, just stared at the floor with a hollow look in his eyes. The mist had finally started to lift, and the forest felt quieter now, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching us. By mid-morning, a rescue team arrived after hearing our emergency radio call. They took James down the mountain for medical treatment, but I stayed behind to help them recover Marcus's body and document what had happened. When I told my supervisor about the creature, he didn't believe me. It was probably just a bear. He said dismissively, "A big one. Maybe injured or sick." I didn't argue, there was no point. Even when I showed him the notes from the cabin and the photos on Angie's camera, he waved them off as coincidences or tricks of the light. The official report blamed the climber's deaths and Angie's on an aggressive animal attack. Marcus's fall was ruled an accident caused by poor visibility in the mist. But I knew the truth. A few weeks later, after things had settled down, I went back to the cabin alone. I needed closure, or maybe answers. I wasn't sure which. The mist was gone now, and the forest felt normal again. But as I approached the clearing where we'd fought the creature, I stopped in my tracks. There, in the trees ahead of me, was another pattern, a spiral of broken branches pointing inward like arrows. It was fresh. I stared at it for a long time before pulling out the timeline from my pocket, the one with all the dates of disappearances. 1932. I folded it carefully and slipped it back into my pack. Then I took out Angie's camera and burned every photo she'd taken that day. The creature, the mist, everything. Finally, I burned all of the research notes from the cabin except for one page, the one with the date of the next cycle, 2067. As the fire crackled and turned those pages to ash, I couldn't help but wonder if anyone would believe me when that year came around, or if they'd even stand a chance. For now, though, all I could do was leave this place behind and hope that whatever was out there wouldn't wake up again for a long time. My name is Luther Reynolds. I've been a park ranger in the Monongahela National Forest for nearly 30 years. Some folks around here call me the prophet because I've got a knack for predicting the weather or knowing when the forest is about to change. It's not magic or anything, it's just experience. You spend enough time out here, you start to feel things before they happen. I'm 58 now, and retirement is creeping up on me like a shadow I can't outrun. Most mornings, I grab my carved wooden cane, an old family heirloom, and head out for my patrol. The cane's been with me since my coal mining days, passed down from my grandfather who swore it could ward off evil. I don't believe in that kind of thing, but it's comforting to hold on to something familiar. This morning started like any other. The air was crisp, and the trees stood tall and quiet as I made my way through a remote section of the forest. It's the part tourists rarely venture into, too rugged, too wild. But as I walked, something felt off. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence. And let me tell you, silence in a forest is never a good sign. I stopped for a moment to take it all in, pressing my fingers to my sinuses. That peculiar pressure was back. The same one I felt every time something bad was about to happen out here. It's like the forest itself was trying to warn me. That's when I saw it. A circle of deadfall traps arranged so perfectly it couldn't be natural. Deadfall traps are piles of branches and logs that collapse when triggered, usually by an animal stepping on them. But these weren't random piles of debris. They were deliberate, placed with precision. Someone, or something, had built them. I knelt down to examine one of the traps, running my fingers over the splintered wood. The cuts were clean, too clean for nature's handiwork. My stomach churned as I stood up and looked around, gripping my cane tighter than usual. Something was wrong in Deadfall Hollow. The next morning, I was called into the ranger station. The air was heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As soon as I walked in, I could tell something serious had happened. Ranger Michael Tate, my old protege, was standing by the map table, arms crossed, looking tense. He barely glanced at me before muttering, "We've got missing hikers." Michael and I used to work well together, but things had changed over the years. He didn't believe in my gut feelings or the way I read the forest. To him, I was just an old man clinging to superstitions. Dr. Amanda Hollis, a professor from the local university, was pacing back and forth near the radio. Her students had gone missing during a biology field trip in Deadfall Hollow. She kept saying they were supposed to check in last night. They wouldn't just wander off. Her voice cracked with worry. I was assigned to lead the search team because of my knowledge of the area. Michael didn't look thrilled about it, but orders were orders. Joining us were Dr. Richard Hayes, a geologist mapping underground water systems in the region, and Jessica Monroe, a search and rescue specialist with her tracking dog, Baron. Jessica seemed confident, but quiet, focused on Baron as he sniffed around the station's porch. Dr. Hayes looked out of place in his clean hiking gear and thick glasses. He didn't seem like someone who spent much time outdoors. Before we headed out, Dr. Hollis handed me a journal she'd found in one of her students' backpacks left behind at camp. "Maybe this will help," she said softly. I flipped through it quickly. It was filled with sketches of tall, thin figures standing among trees. The drawings were rough but unsettling. One page had scribbled notes. "They sit were watching, always watching." I didn't say anything as I tucked the journal into my pack. The forest already felt wrong to me. This just made it worse. As we set out into Deadfall Hollow, Baron led the way, nose to the ground. The silence from yesterday lingered, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, and it gnawed at my nerves like a splinter under my skin. We followed a trail that should have been clear and straightforward, but something wasn't right. Paths that should have been familiar twisted and turned unexpectedly, leading us deeper into unfamiliar territory. It felt like someone or something was rearranging the forest around us. Baron suddenly stopped and growled low in his throat. Jessica knelt beside him, trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't budge. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff as a board. "What's wrong with him?" Michael asked sharply. "He doesn't like something," Jessica replied quietly. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew what Baron was feeling. I'd felt it too. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was watching us. We kept moving deeper into Deadfall Hollow, following Baron's lead. The dog seemed uneasy, his ears twitching at every sound, or lack of sound. Jessica tried to reassure him, but I could tell she was just as nervous as the rest of us. After about an hour of hiking, we found something that made us all stop in our tracks. It was a backpack, half buried under a pile of leaves. Jessica picked it up and dusted it off. "It's one of the students," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Inside the backpack was a water bottle, a flashlight, and another notebook. This one was filled with more sketches. Tall, thin figures with hollow eyes and long arms, standing in the shadows of trees. One page had a single sentence scrawled across it. "Dawn set, follow the tapping." "What does that mean?" Michael asked, frowning at the notebook. I didn't ask her right away. My gut was telling me we were in trouble, but I couldn't explain why without sounding crazy. Instead, I said, "Let's keep moving." A little further down the trail, Dr. Hayes stopped suddenly and crouched down near a patch of dirt. "What is this?" he muttered, holding up a small bone fragment. It was smooth and pale, almost like it had been polished. "It's not from any animal I've seen around here," he added, turning it over in his hands. I took the bone from him and examined it closely. It didn't look natural. It looked crafted somehow, like someone had shaped it deliberately. My grip tightened on my cane as that familiar pressure built in my sinuses again. Baron started barking wildly then, pulling at his leash and refusing to move forward. Jessica tried to calm him down, but he was frantic now, snapping at the air like he could see something we couldn't. "We should turn back," Jessica said firmly, her voice trembling. Michael scoffed. "Turn back? We haven't even found anything yet." "We've found enough," Jessica shot back, holding Baron close. I stepped between them before the argument could escalate. "We keep going?" I said quietly but firmly, "but stay alert." As we walked on, the forest seemed to grow darker even though it was still early afternoon. The trees pressed closer together, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for us. Then came the sound, the faint tapping noise. It was soft at first, barely audible over our footsteps, but as we moved deeper into the hollow, it grew louder and more distinct. Tap, tap, tap. Jessica froze mid-step and whispered, "What is that?" "It's nothing," Michael said quickly, though his voice sounded strained. But I knew better. That tapping wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, almost like Morse code. My grandfather used to tell stories about miners trapped underground who used tapping to communicate with each other when their voices couldn't carry through the rock. The tapping seemed to follow us now, shifting from one side of the trail to the other, as if something or someone was moving alongside us. Baron whined low in his throat and refused to take another step. I gripped my cane tighter and looked over my shoulder at the others. "Stay close," I said quietly. No one argued this time. The tapping followed us. It wasn't constant, but it was always there, sometimes close, sometimes far, but never gone. It made my skin crawl. Every time it stopped, I'd hold my breath, waiting for it to start again. Baron was the first to snap. He broke free from Jessica's grip and bolted into the trees, barking furiously. "Baron!" Jessica screamed, running after him. "Wait!" I shouted, but she didn't listen. She disappeared into the trees before any of us could stop her. Michael cursed under his breath and took off after her. Dr. Hayes and I followed, stumbling over roots and rocks as we tried to keep up. The forest seemed darker now, the air heavier. We found Jessica a few minutes later, standing completely still in a small clearing. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she pointed at something ahead of her. It was Baron, or what was left of him. He was impaled on a wooden spike trap, his body limp and lifeless. The trap looked freshly made, the wood sharp and clean like it had been carved just moments ago. Jessica dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "No, no. This can't be happening," she whispered. Michael turned away, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Dr. Hayes just stood there, frozen in shock. I knelt beside Jessica and put a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. It felt like such an empty thing to say. But what else could I do? "We need to leave," Michael said suddenly, his voice sharp and panicked. "This isn't right. None of this is right." "We can leave," Jessica snapped through her tears, glaring at him. "We haven't found the students yet. They were gone." Michael shouted back. "Don you get it? Whatever out here, it's not going to let us leave either." "Enough," I barked, standing up and gripping my cane tightly. "Both of you calm down." The tapping started again then, louder this time, closer. Tap, 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 tap. It echoed around us, coming from every direction at once. "What is that?" Dr. Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's them," I said before I could stop myself. "Them?" Michael asked, his eyes wide with fear. "The hollow men," I replied quietly. Jessica stared at me like I lost my mind. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's an old legend about this place, about miners who were trapped underground and made some kind of deal to survive. They became something else, something unnatural." "That's ridiculous," Michael said quickly, shaking his head. "Is it?" I asked, gesturing toward Baron's body and the trap that killed him. No one said anything after that. The tapping grew louder still, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. "We need to move," I said finally. "Now?" Jessica wiped her tears and nodded silently. Michael didn't argue this time. As we left the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something that didn't belong in this world. We kept moving, but the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were thicker, the shadows darker, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. No one spoke. Even Michael, who always had something to say, stayed quiet. The tapping followed us. It didn't stop, didn't fade, it was constant, now. Shifting from one side of the trail to the other, tap, 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 tap. It was almost rhythmic, like it had a purpose. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a waterfall hidden deep in the hollow. The water cascaded down into a pool surrounded by jagged rocks and thick moss. Behind the waterfall was a dark opening, a cave. Jessica stopped and stared at it. "Do you think they're in there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. My gut told me this cave was important, but it also screamed at me to stay away. Still, we had no choice. If the students were anywhere, it was here. Dr. Hayes stepped forward eagerly, his flashlight already in hand. "This could be part of the old mining tunnels," he said. "I've been looking for something like this for weeks. Be careful," I warned him. He nodded and crouched down to squeeze through the narrow opening behind the waterfall. The rest of us followed reluctantly, one by one. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the walls glistened with moisture. The cave smelled like earth and decay, a smell that made my stomach turn. Dr. Hayes shined his flashlight along the walls, revealing ancient mining tools scattered across the ground, rusted pickaxes, broken lanterns, and piles of rubble. There were markings on the walls too, strange symbols carved into the rock that looked like they'd been there for decades. "What are these?" Jessica asked, running her fingers over one of the carvings. "Old mining symbols," Dr. Hayes replied, "but these don't make sense." He frowned as he traced one with his finger. We moved deeper into the cave until we reached a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for one person to fit through. "I'll check it out," Dr. Hayes said eagerly before anyone could stop him. "Wait." I called after him, but he was already squeezing through the tight space. His flashlight beam disappeared around a corner, leaving us in near darkness. Minutes passed, long enough for my nerves to start fraying, and then we heard it, a scream. It echoed through the tunnel, sharp and sudden, cutting off as quickly as it started. "Hayes," Michael shouted, but there was no response. Instead, we heard tapping. Soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Tap, tap, tap. Jessica grabbed my arm. "What is that?" "It's him," Michael said shakily. "It's Hayes." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." The tapping grew louder still until it sounded like it was coming from all around us. Then Hayes's voice crackled through his radio. "Help me, please." His words were broken by static and heavy breathing. "Where are you?" Jessica shouted into her own radio. The reply came in tap code. Tap, tap, tap. Jessica stared at me in horror as realization dawned on her face. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly. Michael didn't argue this time. He just nodded and started back toward the entrance with Jessica close behind him. As I followed them out of the cave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us from deep within the shadows. We stumbled out of the cave, gasping for air as if the forest itself had been suffocating us inside. The waterfall roared behind us, but even its sound couldn't drown out the tapping. It was louder now, sharper, echoing through the trees. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap. Jessica clutched her radio tightly, her knuckles white. "That wasn't Hayes," she whispered. "It couldn't have been." Michael didn't respond. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. "This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." I didn't say anything. My eyes were fixed on the tree line ahead of us. Something was moving. Tall, thin shapes gliding between the trees, barely visible in the fading light. "Do you see that?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. "I see it," I replied quietly. The figures were impossibly tall and gaunt, their translucent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. They moved silently, their hollow bones bending and contorting as they slipped through gaps in the trees that no human could fit through. Michael froze mid-step, his eyes wide with fear. What? What are they? The hollow men, I said softly. Jessica turned to me, her face pale. You keep saying that. What does it mean? I hesitated before answering. They were miners once, trapped underground during a cave-in over 100 years ago. The legend says they made a deal to survive, to stretch themselves thin enough to escape the rubble. But whatever they became, it wasn't set human anymore. That's ridiculous, Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. Is it? I asked, gesturing toward the figures in the trees. The tapping grew louder still, surrounding us now like a chorus of bone against wood. They're communicating, Jessica said suddenly, her eyes darting around. What are they saying? Michael asked nervously. Jessica shook her head. I don't know, but it seems not random. I gripped my cane tighter and stepped toward the abandoned ranger station just ahead of us. We need shelter, I said firmly. The others followed without argument. This time, inside the station, we barricaded the doors and windows as best we could. The small building creaked under the weight of the storm brewing outside, wind howling, rain pelting against the roof. But it wasn't the storm we were worried about. Through the cracked glass of one window, I saw them again, the hollow men. They were closer now, their gaunt forms barely visible in the shadows of the trees. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their hollow eyes fixed on the station. Then came the tapping, on the walls this time. Tap, 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 tap. It was so loud now that it felt like it was inside my head. They're trying to get in, Michael whispered, his voice shaking. No, I said quietly. They said trying to tell us something. Jessica stared at me in disbelief. Tell us what? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I focused on the rhythm of the tapping. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. My grandfather had taught me old mining emergency codes when I was a boy, and this pattern was familiar. They dispersed, warning us, I said finally. Warning us about what? Michael asked nervously. I looked out at the figures again, and felt that familiar pressure in my sinuses, the one that always meant danger was close. About a debt? I replied softly. A debt that SEP's about to be collected. The rain hammered against the ranger station, but it was the tapping that kept us frozen in place. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore. It was on the roof, the windows, even the floor beneath our feet. Tap, tap, tap. Jessica sat on the floor, her hands gripping her knees as she stared at the door. Michael paced back and forth, muttering to himself like a man on the edge of losing it. Dr. Hayes was gone, and Barron was dead. We were running out of time. I tried to focus, pulling old records off a dusty shelf in the corner of the room. Most of them were water-damaged and barely legible, but one file caught my eye, an incident report from 1912. Listen to this, I said, my voice cutting through the tension in the room. There was a mining disaster in Deadfall Hollow over 100 years ago. 23 miners were trapped underground after a cave-in. The official report says their bodies were never recovered. Jessica looked up at me, her face pale. What does that have to do with this? I hesitated before continuing. There's SIPs more. Local legends say those miners didn't die down there. Not right away. They made some kind of pact to survive. Michael stopped pacing and stared at me. What kind of pact? I shook my head slowly. No one knows for sure. But whatever they did to escape, it changed them. Jessica Sepp's voice trembled as she asked, change them into what? I didn't instead answer, because we already knew. Michael grabbed one of the records from my hands and flipped through it angrily. This is insane. You're telling me those things out there are miners from over a century ago? That Sepp's impossible. Is it? I asked quietly. Before anyone could respond, Jessica gasped and pointed at something on the floor, a photograph tucked into one of the files. It was an old black and white image of a group of miners standing outside an entrance to Deadfall Hollow. Their faces were grim, their clothes covered in soot and dirt. Jessica's hand shook as she held up the photo for us to see. "Look at this," she whispered. One of the miners was wearing a pocket watch, and it looked exactly like the one my grandfather used to carry. My stomach dropped as memories flooded back. My grandfather's stories about Deadfall Hollow, his warnings about staying away from certain parts of the forest, and his carved wooden cane that he swore could ward off evil. "This isn't set just about those miners," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Seps about what they left behind." Jessica frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. "The missing students, they stir all descendants of mine owners who refused to help those trapped miners." Michael stared at me like I said to lost my mind. "You stare saying this is revenge, after all these years?" "No," I replied softly. "It sets not revenge, it sets justice." The tapping grew louder then, so loud it felt like it was vibrating through my bones. Jessica stood up suddenly, her face pale but determined. "We need to find those students before it sets too late." I nodded and grabbed my cane tightly as we prepared to leave the station. Outside, the Hollow men were waiting, but this time they weren't hiding in the shadows. They were standing in plain sight. We stepped outside into the storm, but the rain wasn't what chilled me. It was the Hollow men. They stood motionless among the trees, tall and gaunt, their translucent skin glowing faintly in the darkness. Their hollow eyes seemed to pierce right through us, as if they could see every secret we'd ever tried to hide. Jessica clutched her flashlight tightly, her breathing shallow. Michael froze in place, his eyes darting between the figures like he was trying to convince himself they weren't real. "They Setra just standing there," Jessica whispered. "Why aren't set they coming closer?" "They don't set need to," I replied quietly. "They stir waiting." "Waiting for what?" Michael snapped, his voice shaking. "For us to make a mistake," I said. We started moving again, following the trail deeper into Deadfall Hollow. The Hollow men didn't follow us, not directly, but I could feel them watching, their presence pressing down on us like a weight I couldn't shake. Michael began muttering to himself as we walked, his voice barely audible over the rain and tapping sounds that never stopped. At first I thought he was just talking out of fear, but then his words became clearer. "It's my dad," he said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. Jessica turned to him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "My dad," Michael repeated, staring into the darkness ahead of us. "I can hear him." I frowned and stepped closer to him. "Michael, your dad Sit's been gone for years." "I know that," he snapped, his voice trembling. "But I can hear him. He Sip's calling me." Jessica grabbed his arm. "Is Sip's not real," she said firmly. "Is Sip's them. They Sips are messing with your head." Michael pulled away from her and stumbled toward the trees, shouting into the darkness. "Dad, where are you?" "Michael," I called after him, but it was no use. He was gone. Jessica turned to me, panic in her eyes. "What do we do?" "We keep moving," I said firmly. "If we stop now, we stare dead." She nodded reluctantly, and we continued down the trail. The tapping grew louder as we walked, so loud it felt like it was inside my head now. My grip on my cane tightened as memories of my grandfather flooded back, his warnings about Deadfall Hollow, his stories about miners who stretched themselves thin to escape death. The pressure in my sinuses grew unbearable, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Jessica stopped suddenly and pointed ahead of us. "Look." There was a faint light in the distance, a flickering glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "It Seps them," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "It Seps something else." We moved toward the light cautiously, our footsteps slow and deliberate. As we got closer, I realized what it was, a circle of lanterns surrounding a group of people sitting motionless on the ground. The missing students. They were alive, but barely. Their faces were pale and blank, their eyes staring straight ahead as if they were trapped in some kind of trance. Jessica rushed forward to check on them while I stood back, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. Then came the sound of bones cracking, a sickening noise that sent chills down my spine. I turned slowly and saw them, the hollow men emerging from impossibly small cracks in the trees and rocks around us. They were closer now, close enough for me to see every unnatural detail of their contorted bodies. One of them stepped forward slowly, and that's when I saw it. He was wearing my grandfather Sip's pocket watch. I froze, staring at the hollow man wearing my grandfather's pocket watch. The chain dangled from his thin, translucent wrist, swaying with every unnatural movement he made. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "Luther," Jessica whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" The hollow men surrounded us now, emerging from cracks in the rocks and trees, their bodies bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. They didn't rush us, they didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to paralyze us with fear. I gripped my cane tightly and stepped forward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "You're here for me, aren't you?" I said, my voice shaking but steady enough to be heard. Jessica turned to me, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you talking about?" I didn't take my eyes off the hollow man as I spoke. My grandfather, he was part of the mining company that owned Deadfall Hollow. He knew about the cave-in, he knew those miners were trapped, but he didn't do anything to help them. Jessica stared at me in shock. "How do you know that?" I swallowed hard and nodded toward the hollow man with the pocket watch. "Because he told me years ago, he said there was a debt that would have to be paid someday." The hollow men moved closer now, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Michael stumbled out of the shadows suddenly, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "They're not going to stop," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Michael," Jessica said, rushing toward him, but he waved her off. "They want him," Michael said, pointing at me. "They want Luther." Jessica turned to me, her face pale. "You can sit, let them take you." I shook my head slowly and looked at her with a sad smile. "It's not about what I let them do, it's about what has to be done." The hollow men stopped just a few feet away from us now, their tapping replaced by an eerie silence. I stepped forward and held out my cane, the one my grandfather had carved all those years ago. "Take me," I said quietly. Jessica grabbed my arm desperately. "No, there has to be another way." "There isn't," I replied softly. "This is the only way to save them." The hollow men moved closer still, their hollow eyes locked on me as they reached out with their impossibly long arms. But before they could touch me, Michael shouted suddenly and ran toward the mineshaft entrance just behind them. "Michael!" Jessica screamed. He turned back to us briefly, his face filled with determination. "Get out of here. Now." Before any of us could stop him, he triggered a cave-in by smashing through one of the old support beams with a rock. The ground shook violently as rocks and debris collapsed around us, sealing the mine entrance and trapping Michael inside with the hollow men. Jessica screamed his name over and over again, but it was too late. The entrance was completely sealed now. I grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the collapsing rocks as she sobbed uncontrollably. The tapping stopped completely, then replaced by silence so deep it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. 3 months passed, but Deadfall Hollow never left my mind. The forest was quiet now. Too quiet. The search team had sealed off the mine entrance, declaring it unsafe for further exploration. Official reports listed Michael as missing, presumed dead, along with the students we managed to rescue. Jessica hadn't spoken much since that day. She'd quit search and rescue and moved out of town, but I knew she hadn't really left Deadfall Hollow behind. None of us had. One rainy afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest again, staring at the sealed mine entrance. I wasn't sure why I'd come back. Maybe to find closure, maybe to feel something other than guilt. The ground was damp beneath my boots as I placed a small bouquet of wildflowers near the rocks where we'd last seen Michael. Jessica had asked me to bring them here, though she couldn't face coming herself. I stood there for a while, listening to the rain pattering against the leaves, hoping for some kind of peace. But then I heard it, the tapping. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain. Tap, 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 tap. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the mine entrance. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. But then it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I stepped back instinctively, gripping my cane tightly as the sound echoed through the forest. And then I saw it, a figure standing among the trees just beyond the mine entrance. It was tall and thin, its translucent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't set moving, it was just watching. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was carrying. My cane. The carved wood looked worn but familiar, swinging gently in its bony hand as it stood motionless in the shadows. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground as the tapping grew louder still, spreading through the forest like a ripple in still water. The figure turned slowly and disappeared into the trees without a sound. I stood there for what felt like hours before finally turning away and walking back toward town, my heart heavy with a truth I couldn't escape. Deadfall Hollow wasn't set finished. Not yet. In the distance behind me, the tapping continued, soft and steady, like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. Tap, tap, tap. My name is Elijah Washington. I'm 43 years old, a wildlife biologist and a park ranger at the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge in Georgia. I've spent most of my life studying wetlands and their ecosystems, but this swamp is different. It's alive in ways I can't fully explain, even after all these years. I came back to Okefenokee after 2 decades away. This place was my childhood home, but it holds memories I've tried to bury. Memories of my brother Daniel. He disappeared here when we were teenagers, swallowed by the swamp without a trace. I've carried the guilt ever since. Maybe that's why I came back to find answers, or maybe just some peace. The swamp is quiet, almost too quiet today. The air is thick with humidity, and the smell of damp earth clings to me as I steer my boat deeper into the refuge. I'm here to conduct water quality tests, but honestly, I'm just looking for excuses to stay out here longer. There's something about the swamp that feels like home, even with its secrets and shadows. As I dip my testing equipment into the murky water, I notice something strange, a patch of vines twisting unnaturally fast around a nearby cypress tree. The movement is subtle at first, almost like they're breathing. My heart skips a beat when I see a deer struggling nearby, its legs tangled in those same vines. The poor thing looks terrified, but as soon as I approach, the vines retreat into the water like snakes slithering away. I freeze for a moment, trying to process what I just saw. Plants don't move like that. Not unless there's wind or something pulling them, but there's no wind here, not even a breeze. The swamp feels still, like it's holding its breath. I push my boat further into the refuge, following what looks like a narrow path formed by cypress trees leaning toward each other. It's strange. This path wasn't here before. I know this area like the back of my hand. I've mapped it dozens of times. Yet these trees seem to have rearranged themselves overnight. The deeper I go, the more uneasy I feel. The swamp isn't just alive, it's watching me. The next morning, I was back at the ranger station, sorting through my notes from the previous day. I couldn't stop thinking about those vines and the strange path in the swamp. I wanted to go back and investigate, but something told me to wait. That's when the call came in. A documentary film crew had gone missing. They were shooting a segment on rare bird species deep in the refuge and hadn't checked in for over 24 hours. Their last transmission was odd. The dispatcher played it for me. We stutter seeing moving trees, paths that change. This doesn't make sense. Then silence. I felt a chill run down my spine. Moving trees, changing paths. It sounded ridiculous, but after what I'd seen yesterday, I wasn't so sure anymore. The park authorities organized a search party, and I was put in charge. The team was small but capable. There was Dr. Layla Jenkins, a botanist studying accelerated plant growth in the refuge. Ranger Darius Wells, my childhood friend who knew this swamp better than anyone. Teresa Alvarez, a tech specialist with drones and tracking equipment, and Marcus Green, a local guide who could navigate even the trickiest waterways. We set out early, hoping to find the crew before nightfall. The swamp was eerily quiet again, the only sounds coming from our boat's motor and the occasional splash of water. As we moved deeper into the refuge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It didn't take long to find their boat. It was abandoned near a cluster of cypress trees. Cameras and equipment were still inside, but there was no sign of the crew. Teresa pulled up their last footage on one of the cameras, and what we saw made my stomach turn. The video showed glimpses of something humanoid but not human. It was tall and thin, made entirely of vines and swamp vegetation. Its movements were jerky but deliberate, like it was watching them from a distance. The crew's voices in the background sounded panicked. "What is that thing?" one of them whispered. The video cut off abruptly. "Could be a prank," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's not a prank," Darius muttered under his breath. I looked at him sharply. "You know something?" He hesitated before answering. "There sips an old legend around here about a green man, a creature that lives in the swamp and takes people who wander too far." "Come on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Legends don't make vines move or paths disappear." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. We decided to camp nearby and continue searching in the morning. That night, strange things started happening. Vines appeared on our tents and equipment, vines that hadn't been there when we set up camp. Our GPS devices stopped working, leading us in circles when we tried to test them. Teresa sent up one of her drones to get an aerial view of the area. When she showed us the footage later, my heart sank. The vegetation below formed geometric patterns, circles and lines that looked deliberate, like they were guiding us somewhere. Somewhere we didn't want to go. The next morning, the swamp felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. None of us had slept well. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves had kept us on edge. Marcus swore he heard whispers during the night, but no one else admitted to hearing them. We packed up quickly and continued the search. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The cypress trees seemed taller, their roots twisting into unnatural shapes. The water turned darker, almost black, and smelled faintly of decay. Then we found something that stopped us cold. The film crew's cameras were still running. They'd been left in a small clearing, surrounded by thick vines. Teresa played back the footage, and what we saw made my stomach churn. The camera showed the crew walking through the swamp, their voices tense as they argued about which direction to go. Then the vines started moving, slowly at first, then faster, wrapping around their legs and arms. The crew screamed and fought to break free, but it was no use. The last shot showed a humanoid figure made of vines standing in the distance, watching them silently. "Turn it off," Layla said, her voice shaking. Teresa hesitated before shutting off the camera. "We're not alone here," Marcus muttered. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to respond. As we pushed further into the swamp, strange things kept happening. Our compasses spun wildly, refusing to point north. The GPS devices still didn't work, and even Teresa's drones started acting up, flying in circles, no matter how she tried to control them. At one point, we came across old survey markers carved into trees. They were warnings written in multiple languages: English, Spanish, even Cherokee. One of them read, "Turn back now." Darius stared at the marker for a long time before speaking. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about this place," he said quietly. "He said there sips a part of the swamp that doesn't want people here." "What does that mean?" Layla asked. "It means we shouldn't be here," he replied. But turning back wasn't an option, not yet. That night, I had a dream about my brother. He was standing in the swamp, calling my name over and over again. His voice sounded distant but desperate, like he needed me to find him. When I woke up, I realized I was sweating and shaking. I didn't tell anyone about the dream, not yet. The swamp felt different the next day, like it was alive and aware of us. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and the silence more oppressive. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. We moved cautiously, following what we hoped was a path forward. But every time we thought we were making progress, something would change. A tree that wasn't there before, a patch of water that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was like the swamp itself was playing tricks on us. As we trudged through the muck, Darius walked up beside me. He had that look on his face, the one he always got when he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "You've been quiet," he said finally. "Just thinking." I replied, though it wasn't the whole truth. "You had another dream, didn't you?" he asked. I stopped in my tracks and stared at him. "How did you know?" He shrugged. "I know you, Elijah. You've been dreaming about your brother ever since we got here." "Haven't set you?" I didn't answer right away. Finally, I nodded. "He's calling to me, Darius. In my dreams, he's out here somewhere." Darius sighed and looked around the swamp like he was searching for something. "My grandfather used to say this place remembers people," he said quietly. "It holds on to them, especially if they are lost or taken." "Taken?" I asked sharply. He hesitated before answering. "The green man," he said finally. "That's what my grandfather called it. He said it takes one person every generation, someone who gets too close to its territory." I wanted to dismiss it as just another legend, but after everything we'd seen so far, I couldn't ignore it anymore. We pressed on in silence until Teresa called out from behind us. "You guys need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. She'd managed to get one of her drones working again and had sent it up for an aerial view of the area. The footage showed something incredible and terrifying. The vegetation below formed perfect geometric patterns, circles, spirals, and lines that stretched for miles. "It's like a map," Layla said, leaning over Teresa's shoulder. "But a map to what?" Marcus asked uneasily. No one had an answer. As we moved deeper into the swamp, we came across something else, a clearing with remnants of old wooden structures and stone carvings. Layla examined the carvings closely and frowned. "These are ancient," she said softly. "They are not from any culture I studied in this region." "What do they mean?" I asked. "I'm not sure," she replied, "but they look like warnings." The more we explored, the more uneasy I felt. The swamp wasn't just alive, it was guiding us somewhere, and I had a sinking feeling that wherever it was leading us, we wouldn't like what we found. By the time the storm rolled in, we were already on edge. The sky turned a sickly shade of gray, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees like they were whispering to each other. We had no choice but to take shelter in an old hunting cabin we stumbled across. It was falling apart. Half the roof was caved in, and the wooden floorboards creaked with every step, but it was better than being out in the open. The rain came hard and fast, pounding against the cabin's walls. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't enough to drown out the unease that had settled over us. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm and trying not to think about what might be waiting for us outside. Then it happened. At first it was just a faint sound, a creaking noise coming from beneath the floorboards. I thought it might be the wind, or maybe an animal seeking shelter, but then I saw it. Vines started pushing up through the cracks in the wood, twisting and curling like they had a mind of their own. "Do you see that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. We all froze, watching as the vines grew thicker and faster, spreading across the floor like they were searching for something. Then they stopped and began to form a shape. A crude humanoid figure made entirely of vines stood before us, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't attack. It didn't even move toward us. Instead, it mimicked my movements, tilting its head when I tilted mine, raising its arm when I raised mine. It was like looking into a warped mirror. What is it doing?" Layla asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the old radio in the corner crackled to life. It had been silent since we arrived, but now it was producing static and then words. "Brother. Returned." The voice was distorted and broken, but I recognized it instantly. It was Daniel's voice. My brother's voice. My chest tightened as I stumbled back a step. "Daniel?" I whispered. The vines moved closer to me, their shape shifting slightly as if responding to my words. The radio crackled again. "Come. Find me." The others stared at me in shock, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could think about was Daniel, his voice calling to me from somewhere deep in this swamp. "I don't understand," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "Where are you?" The vines didn't answer, not directly. Instead, they began retreating back into the floorboards, leaving behind only silence and a faint smell of damp earth. For a long time, none of us said anything. Finally, Darius broke the silence. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "Now." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not while Daniel's voice was still echoing in my head. The storm passed by morning, but the swamp didn't feel any less menacing. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence was unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. None of us talked much as we packed up and continued deeper into the swamp. The memory of those vines and Daniel's voice hung over us like a shadow. The path led us to a place unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was a hidden grotto surrounded by towering cypress trees, their roots forming arches over pools of dark water. The air smelled strange, not like the usual damp earth and decay, but something sharper, almost metallic. Layla was the first to notice the plants. "These don't belong here," she said, crouching to examine a cluster of flowers growing near the water sepset's edge. "They are not native to this region, or even this continent." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, his voice uneasy. "It means something brought them here," she replied, her tone grim. As we explored the grotto, we started finding signs of people, remnants of old ceremonies and rituals. There were stone carvings covered in moss, wooden structures that had nearly rotted away, and what looked like offerings bowls filled with dried herbs and animal bones. "This is ancient," Layla said softly, "but it's not like anything I studied before." Then we found something that made my stomach turn: human remains. They weren't fresh, but they weren't fully decomposed either. Some were tangled in vines, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Others were embedded in the bark of trees, their features barely visible beneath layers of moss and wood. "This is wrong," Teresa whispered, her voice shaking. The sight brought back memories I'd tried to bury, memories of Daniel disappearing into this swamp all those years ago. Was this what had happened to him? Had he been taken by whatever was out here? As we moved deeper into the grotto, I started recognizing things, landmarks from my childhood. A fallen tree I used to climb on, a patch of wildflowers my brother and I had discovered together, and then I saw it. The path we'd taken the day Daniel disappeared. "This is it," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "This is where it happened." Darius looked at me sharply. "You sure?" I nodded, my chest tightening as memories flooded back. Daniel running ahead of me, laughing as he splashed through the water, me shouting for him to slow down, and then nothing. He was gone. The others didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, Layla spoke up. "Whatever sets out here, it's been here for centuries," she said quietly. "And it's not just taking people, it's keeping them." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The swamp seemed to close in around us after that. The trees felt taller, the shadows darker, and the air heavier with every step we took. It wasn't just a feeling, it was real. The swamp was changing, rearranging itself like it was alive. We followed the path deeper into the grotto, but it wasn't long before something went wrong. Marcus was walking ahead of us when the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. Cypress knees, those strange knobby roots that stick up out of the water, rose suddenly, forming a wall between him and the rest of us. "Marcus," I shouted, rushing forward, but the wall was solid, twisting and growing faster than I could react. "I'm stuck," Marcus yelled from the other side. His voice was panicked, and I could hear him struggling to move. We tried to break through the wall, hacking at the roots with machetes and anything else we could find, but it was no use. The cypress knees were like iron, unyielding and alive. Then Marcus screamed, a sound so raw and primal, it made my blood run cold. When we finally managed to push through to the other side, what we saw stopped us in our tracks. Marcus was partially absorbed into a tree. His arms and legs were tangled in vines, his body pressed against the bark as if it were swallowing him whole. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was still conscious, still alive. "Help me," he begged, his voice breaking. We tried to pull him free, but the vines tightened around him like they were fighting back. Layla examined them closely and shook her head. "They're feeding on him," she said quietly. "What does that mean?" Teresa demanded. "It means we can't save him," Layla replied grimly. Marcus looked at me then, his eyes full of desperation, and I knew he understood. There was nothing we could do. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The vines tightened further, pulling Marcus deeper into the tree until his face disappeared completely. The swamp had taken him. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Darius spoke up. "We need to keep moving," he said firmly. "If we stay here, we stay next." He was right, but leaving Marcus behind felt like a betrayal. Still, we had no choice. As we moved on, Teresa's equipment started acting up again. Her drone cameras flickered and shut off one by one. When she checked her tablet, she found something even worse. Plant matter had started growing on her devices. It wasn't just vines, it was small buds and leaves, like the swamp itself had infected her technology. "This isn't possible," she muttered, trying to scrape off the growths with shaking hands. But it was possible because it was happening right in front of us. The swamp was just alive, it was hunting us. We didn't talk much after what happened to Marcus. The swamp had taken him, and there was nothing we could do, but the silence between us wasn't just grief, it was fear. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all knew the truth. The swamp was alive and it wasn't going to let us leave. The path ahead grew narrower, forcing us to wade through water that came up to our knees. The smell of decay was stronger now, and the air felt thick enough to choke on. Every step felt like a struggle, like the swamp itself was trying to pull us down. Then we saw it. An island rose out of the water ahead of us, its surface covered in moss and tangled roots. At its center stood a massive cypress tree, easily the largest I'd ever seen. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, and its branches stretched high into the sky like skeletal arms. But it wasn't just a tree. Faces were embedded in its bark, human faces. They were twisted in expressions of pain and fear, their features barely visible beneath layers of moss and wood. My stomach turned as I recognized some of them. The missing film crew, Marcus, and my brother. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His face was there, pressed into the trunk near the base of the tree. His eyes were closed, but his expression looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping. "Elijah," Layla said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We need to be careful." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us began to shift. Vines erupted from the water, twisting and curling around our legs. We scrambled backward as they formed a shape, a towering humanoid figure made entirely of vegetation. The Tangle Walker. It stood at least 10 feet tall, its body a mass of vines, roots, and swamp plants. Flowers grew from its eye sockets, their petals opening and closing like they were alive. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching us with an unnatural stillness. Then it spoke, not with words, but through the radio Teresa had been carrying in her pack. The static crackled before forming a distorted voice. "Brother, you came." I froze as the voice hit me like a punch to the chest. It was Daniel's voice again, broken and distant, but unmistakable. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. The Tangle Walker tilted its head slightly, as if considering my question. Then the vines around us tightened, pulling us closer to the island. "Join or leave," the voice said through the radio. "What does that mean?" Teresa asked, her voice rising in panic. "It's giving us a choice," Darius said grimly. "But I don't think either option is good." I looked back at Daniel's face in the tree trunk. His eyes were open now, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Was he trying to warn me, or was he asking me to stay? The Tangle Walker raised one massive arm, pointing toward the central tree. The message was clear. It wanted me to join Daniel to become part of whatever this thing was. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not leaving without him." The Tangle Walker didn't respond, not with words anyway. Instead, it began moving toward us. Its steps slow but deliberate. "We need to do something," Layla said urgently. "Now." The tangle walker moved closer, its towering form casting a shadow over the island. The vines around us tightened, pulling at our legs and arms like they were trying to drag us toward the tree. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at Daniel's face in the bark. I couldn't leave him here. Not like this. We have to stop it, Teresa shouted, her voice breaking. But how? Layla asked, frantically looking around. It was Darius who answered. The roots, he said, pointing to the ground beneath the massive tree, its septs connected to the swamp through an underground network, fungal systems, plant life, everything. If we destroy the roots, we might weaken it. Destroy them how? I asked, my voice shaking. Darius didn't hesitate. He pulled a small container of gasoline from his pack, the kind we used for emergencies, and held it up. We burn it? No, Layla protested. We don't know what that will do. It could destroy the entire ecosystem. That's already destroying us, Darius said firmly. If we don't do this, none of us are getting out of here. I knew he was right, but the thought of setting fire to this place, to the tree that held Daniel, made my stomach turn. Still, there was no other choice. Darius moved quickly, pouring gasoline around the base of the tree, while Layla and Teresa tried to keep the vines at bay. The tangle walker seemed to sense what we were doing. It let out a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the air, and its movements became faster, more aggressive. Elijah, Zariah shouted as he struck a match. You need to say goodbye. I turned back to Daniel's face in the bark. His eyes were open now, staring at me with an expression that was both pleading and resigned. I stepped closer, ignoring the vines that clawed at my legs. Sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. So sorry. His lips moved slightly, just enough for me to hear one word: free. The match hit the ground, and flames erupted around the base of the tree. The fire spread quickly, consuming the roots and sending thick black smoke into the air. The tangle walker let out another guttural sound, this time louder and more desperate as its body began to collapse. The vines around us loosened, and for a moment, I thought we might actually make it out alive. But then Layla screamed. I turned just in time to see her pulled into a mass of vines that had erupted from the ground near the edge of the island. She fought desperately, but it was no use. The swamp had claimed her. Layla, Teresa shouted, but Darius grabbed her arm and pulled her back. We have to go, he yelled. The flames were spreading fast now, consuming everything in their path. The tangle walker collapsed completely, its body disintegrating into ash and smoke. I looked back one last time at Daniel's face in the tree trunk. It was gone now, replaced by charred wood and embers. We ran for the boat as the fire consumed the island behind us. The swamp seemed to roar with anger as we escaped into open water, but I didn't look back. The boat cut through the water as we sped away from the burning island. None of us spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the motor and the occasional crackle of flames in the distance. The swamp was alive with movement. Trees swayed, vines writhed, and shadows darted across the water like they were chasing us. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back. I couldn't bear to see what was left of the island or Daniel. My chest ached with guilt and grief, but there was no time to process it. Survival was all that mattered now. Teresa sat beside me, clutching her tablet tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Teresa steered the boat with steady hands, his expression grim but focused. We didn't talk about Layla, not yet. The loss was too fresh, too raw. When we finally reached the ranger station, everything felt surreal. The swamp looked almost normal again. Quiet, still, and deceptively peaceful. But I knew better now. I knew what it was capable of. The official report listed the incident as an accidental swamp fire caused by lightning. No one wanted to believe our story about moving trees and humanoid vines, not even the park authorities. They chalked up the disappearances to natural hazards and human error. But I knew the truth. I resigned from the Park Service a week later. I couldn't stay, not after everything that had happened. The swamp had taken too much from me. My brother, my friend, and a part of myself I'd never get back. Teresa left too, but she stayed in touch. A few months later, she called me with something strange to tell me. Elijah, she said hesitantly, I think it followed me. What are you talking about? I asked. She sent me a photo, a patch of small plants growing near her home hundreds of miles away from Okefenokee. The vegetation formed a familiar pattern, spirals and circles like the ones we'd seen in the drone footage. It sits watching me, she said quietly. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her she was imagining things that it wasn't possible, but deep down, I knew better. The swamp doesn't forget. The final scene played out in my mind every night, the burned island slowly regrowing itself as new shoots emerged from the ashes, and then something else. A familiar humanoid shape formed from fresh vines and roots, standing tall among the cypress trees. A single flower bloomed on its chest, its petals opening to reveal what looked like a human eye. The swamp wasn't done,